Hello and welcome to the Intrusible Chamber. Telemachus, son of Odysseus, Fenelon's Anti-Machiavel prince. Is the 1699 Télémaque or Telemachus a fable, a spin-off of the Odyssey following the adventures of Odysseus' son, a fable that inspired many operas and is said to have been the most widely published fable of the 18th century? In Fenelon's Dialogues with the Dead, he fabricates a conversation between Homer and Achilles, where Homer declares, "The nation-subduing heroes are buried in oblivion. Only the muses and by extension the poets can immortalize, and it is through the hero's virtue, not his vanity, that he becomes deserving." So, Fenelon, the Catholic Archbishop of Cambrai, chooses to immortalize the virtuous Telemachus. Is Telemachus then, as we will see, a Christianized reimagining of Homer? Is it a thesis novel whose wild success enraptured the literary scene of the 18th century, a work which inspired the philosophy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau? Or is Telemachus a work of truest philosophy, philosophy literally meaning the love of wisdom, and the work being an instruction to a prince to love the physical embodiment of wisdom, because his mentor, literally called mentor, is none other than Athena, the Greek goddess of wisdom, who speaks on the unique light, infinite and immutable, without dividing sovereign, universal truth. He who has never seen this pure light is blind as if born blind, spending his life in a profound night, believes he sees all and sees nothing. At most, false glimmers, vain shades and phantoms, as all are swept away by the sensual enchantment of the unreal. It is reason that inspires us when we think well. It is reason that corrects us when we think poorly. Reason is like a great ocean of light. Our minds are like streams that leave it and return in order to lose themselves in it. If you take the words of Athena from Telemachus here as a thesis statement for what is attempted in the work, then I would definitely count it among a work of truest philosophy. The title of the stream, The Anti-Machiavel Prince, was inspired by Frederick II of Prussia and Voltaire's Anti-Machiavel, which came out in the year 1740. It's impossible, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of looking at how successful Fenelon's Telemachus was, and then looking at how Frederick II tried to create a treatise opposing Machiavellianism, and how Telemachus follows many of the same beats, albeit the work was published over 40 years before, how such a notion of the anti-Machiavel prince cannot equally be applied to Telemachus. Telemachus's pursuit of Odysseus through Tartarus, through the afterlife, because he believes Odysseus is dead, there is a perfect encapsulation of the novel, a vivid exposition on the fallen state of kings, the result of Fenelon's abundant creativity in the service of an education of a virtuous prince. And this is again reading from Telemachus. Telemachus spied the kings in Tartarus, who were condemned for having abused their power. Telemachus makes out pale, hideous and dismayed faces. It is a black sadness that gnaws at these criminals. They are horrified with themselves and can no more deliver themselves from this horror than from their own nature. They need no other punishment for their transgressions than their transgressions themselves. If you understand Dante and very much see this as a microcosm for a lot of the themes that Dante wanted to put forward in the Inferno, then the whole idea of the metamorphosis of the individual into sin is the recurring theme. They see them unceasingly in all their enormity. They appear before them as horrible spectres. They pursue them. To save themselves from them, they seek a death more powerful than that which separates them from their bodies. In the despair where they find themselves, they call to their rescue a death they can extinguish all feeling and all consciousness in them. They ask for the abyss to engulf them and to rid themselves of the vengeful rays of truth which persecutes them. But they are reserved for a vengeance trickling down on them, drip by drip, which will never go dry. We've already become accustomed to the idea of what Athena has presented as truth, as being the unique, immutable light. Truth which they had feared seeking makes their torment. They see it and only have eyes to see it rising up against them. The sight of it pierces them, rips them apart, tears them from themselves. It is like a lightning bolt. Without destroying anything on the outside, it penetrates to the depths of the bowels like metal in a blazing furnace. The soul is melted by the avenging fire. It leaves nothing of consistence, yet it consumes nothing. It dissolves down to the first principles of life, and one cannot die. One is torn from oneself. One can no longer find either support or repose for a single instant. One no longer lives, but through the rage one has against oneself, and through a loss of all hope, which brings madness. Among those sights that made Telemachus's hair stand on end, he saw former kings of Lydia, who were punished for having preferred the delights of a soft life to the work that must be inseparable from kingship, as to relieve the peoples. The emphasis on softness, luxury, being born to the purple, is a repeated theme that will be covered extensively. These kings were approaching each other for their blindness. One said to another who had been his son, "Did I not recommend to you often during my old age and before my death to mend the evils I had done through my negligence?" The son answered, "O wretched father, it is you who ruined me. It is your example that accustomed me to splendor, to playfulness, to voluptuousness." Voluptuousness here is a catch-all, really, which describes lust and sexual proclivities, to harshness towards men. And seeing you reign with so much softness, with so many craven flatterers around you, I was accustomed to loving flattery and pleasures. I believe the rest of men were, with regard to kings, what horses and other beasts of burden were regard to men. That is to say, animals to which one attaches importance only to the extent they render services and they give comfort and convenience. I believed it. It is you who made me believe it, and now I suffer so many woes for having imitated you. The aspect of becoming or succumbing to flattery and regarding men as beasts, regarding men as slaves, that is an extension of Fenelon's particular critique of a certain type of kingship that was emerging out of the 17th century that can be applied to Louis XIV. To these reproaches they added the most dreadful curses and appeared animated with rage to rip each other apart. Around those kings still flitted like owls in the night cruel suspicions, vain alarms, distrusts to avenge the peoples for the harshness of their kings, avarice, the insatiable thirst for riches, false glory, ever tyrannical, and craven softness that redoubles all the woes one suffixes without ever being able to give solid pleasure. One saw several of those kings severely punished, not for the evils they had done, but for the goods they should have done. All the crimes against the people that came from the negligence which the laws were observed were imputed to the kings, who must only reign in order that the laws reign through their ministry. Also imputed to them was all disorders which come from splendor, luxury, and all other excesses that hurl men into a violent state, and into the temptation to scorn the law so as to acquire possessions. Above all, they treated rigorously the kings who, instead of being good and vigilant pastors of the people, had only thought to ravish the flocks like devouring wolves. The emphasis on the king being a father, being a shepherd, but also notice this aspect of the king's negligence, where the king omits any responsibility for his rule and is content basically to be ruled by wicked counselors or to delegate his authority, even though he effectively surrenders the welfare of his kingdom in so doing. Again, to refer back to Dante, because this is an exposition of Telemachus's transportation through hell, is that Dante reserved a corner of hell for those who achieve nothing in their life, for the de facto sin of passivity. But when it comes to kingship in general, that comes with it a terrible cost in terms of the abdication of responsibility. But what dismayed Telemachus even more was seeing in this abyss of darkness and woes a great number of kings who had passed on earth for fairly good kings. They had been condemned to the pains of Tartarus for having allowed themselves to be governed by wicked and artful men. They were punished for the evils they had allowed done through their authority. Moreover, most of their kings had neither been good nor wicked, so much as their weakness had been great. They had never feared, not knowing the truth. They had not had a taste for virtue, and had not put their pleasure in doing good. When Telemachus got out of those places, he felt relieved as if a mountain had been lifted off his chest. He understood by this relief the wretchedness of those who were confined there without hope of ever getting out. Again, hell in its purest essence is to be deprived of the love of God. He was horrified to see how much more rigorously kings were tormented than many of the other culprits. Emphasis again that kingship has its burdens and responsibilities that are so much more crushing when compared to the lives of ordinary citizens or subjects. What then, Telemachus said, so many duties, so many perils, so many traps, so many difficulties involved in knowing the truth in order to protect oneself against others and against oneself. In the end, so many horrible torments in the underworld, after having been so agitated, so envied, so double-crossed in one short life. O fool, the one who seeks to reign. Happy is the one who is confided to a private and peaceful station where virtue is less difficult. Reflecting so, Telemachus was distrust within. He shuddered and fell into dismay that made him feel something of the despair that those wretches whom he had just considered. But as he distanced himself from that sad domain of darkness, horror, and despair, his courage began, little by little, to be reborn. He breathed and already glimpsed in the distance the gentle and pure light of the resting place of heroes. Again, the light of reason becomes the light of the Elysian fields. There dwelt all the good kings who had up until then governed men wisely. They were separated from the rest of the just. As the wicked princes suffered in Tartarus infinitely more rigorous tortures than the other guilty of a private station, ordinary men, so did the good kings enjoy in the Elysian fields a happiness infinitely greater than that of the rest of men who had loved virtue on earth. Telemachus advanced through those kings, who were in fragrant groves or evergreen and blooming laws. 1,000 tiny brooks of a clear water flowed through these beautiful places and caused a delightful coolness to be felt there. An infinite number of birds made these groves resound with their sweet song. One saw the flowers of spring sprouting underfoot together with the richest fruit of autumn hanging from the trees. There never did one feel the blazing heat of the relentless dog days of summer. There never did the dark north wind dare to blow, nor make the rigours of winter felt. Neither bloodthirsty war nor cruel envy, who bites with a venomous tooth and wears vipers entwined around her breasts and around her arms, nor jealousies, nor distrusts, nor fear, nor vain desires ever approach this happy resting place of peace. The day does not end there, and night, with its shadowy veils, is unknown. A pure and gentle light radiates around the bodies of those just men, and surrounds them with its rays like a vestment. This light is not the sombre light that gleams in the eyes of wretched mortals, yet is only darkness. It is more of a celestial glory than a light. It penetrates more subtly the thickest bodies than the rays of the sun penetrate the purest crystal. It never dazzles, on the contrary. It fortifies the eyes and carries into the depths of the soul an indescribable serenity. It is from this light alone that these blissful men are nourished. It emerges from them and enters into them. It penetrates them, incorporates itself in them like food incorporates itself in us. They see it, they feel it, they breathe it, and it causes them to be born in an endless source of peace. They are plunged into the abyss of joy like fish into the sea. They no longer desire anything. They have everything without having anything. For this taste of pure light appeases the hunger of their hearts. All their desires are sated, and their plenitude elevates them above all men, empty and starving, seek on earth. All the delights that surround them are nothing to them, because their overflowing bliss, which comes with them, leaves them no sentiment for all they see of delights without. They see like the gods who, seated with nectar and ambrosia, would not deign to nourish themselves on the coarse meats that one would present to them as the most exquisite table of mortal men. All woes flee from far from the tranquil places, death, malady, poverty, pain, regrets, remorse, fears, even hopes, which often exact as many difficulties as fears, divisions, disgusts, and spite can have no entry here. In other words, they are not affected with the mortal curse which comes with the opening of Pandora's box or jar. The high mountains of Thrace that split the clouds with their brow, covered in snow and ice since the origins of the world, will be upended for their foundations set down at the centre of the earth before the hearts of those just men who could be sired. They only pity the miseries that crush men living in the world, but it is gentle and peaceful pity that distorts none of their immutable bliss. An eternal youth, an everlasting bliss, a holy divine glory painted on their faces, but their joy has nothing of cultish antics nor indecency. It is gentle, noble, full of majesty. It is a sublime taste for truth and virtue that transports them. They remain without interruption, every moment in the same heart-stopping joy of a mother who sees her dead son again. They know the elation of intoxication without the trouble or blindness of it. Hence again, as with reason, our minds are like streams that leave it and return in order to lose themselves in it. Such is the joy of reason as to be found also as the intoxicating trance that one is left in the Elysian fields for those who have succeeded in kingship, in mortal life. They talk about what they see and what they enjoy. They trample underfoot the effete delights and vain grandeurs of their former stations, which they deplore. They gladly revisit sad but short years when it was necessary to battle each other for the torrent of corrupt men so as to become good. They marvel at the succor of the gods who led them as if by hand to virtue through so many perils. A certain divineness unceasingly streams through their hearts, like a torrent of the divinity itself merging with theirs. They see, they enjoy, they are happy, and they feel as if they always will be. They sing all together the praises of the gods, and they all together but a single voice, a single thought, a single heart. The same bliss ebbs and flows in these merged souls. And that again, the notion, almost as if the afterlife is of a symphonic quality, is something which Fenelon will try and ascribe to the proper management of a finely tuned working machinery of government. Telemachus, who was seeking his father and had feared finding him in these beautiful places, was so seized with the taste of peace and bliss that he would have wanted to have found Odysseus there, and he was himself afflicted to be compelled to return afterwards to the company of mortals. It is here, Telemachus said, that true life is found, and ours is only a death. To place this again in perspective and to Christianize what Fenelon has done with Homer is to again look at life essentially as the abnegation of life, the sort of act of pure selflessness to abandon all the vices and all the corruptions of life. It is, many people have described this theologically, as committing yourself to a form of living death. And Fenelon is nothing if not a purist in this respect, in order that we understand, again from a Christian point of view, that the true life is the afterlife. But what astonished him was having seen so many kings punished in Tartarus, and seeing so few of them in the Elysian fields. Telemachus realized that there are few kings steadfast enough and courageous enough to resist their own might and reject the flattery of so many people who excite all their passions. So good kings are very rare. Most are so wicked, the gods would not be just if, after having tolerated their abuse of power during their life, they did not punish them after their deaths. The bliss is unequaled, yet at the same time, it is a path that very few are able to successfully travel, most leading through an almost inexhaustible series of traps and pitfalls will find themselves consigned to Tartarus in one way or another. This is where I want to return to Fenelon's overarching theme and intention. This is a short segment from Benjamin Thompson and Robert Lamb's Disinterestedness Virtue. Fenelon's conception of disinterested love can be drawn out by contrast with his beliefs concerning political and religious self-interestedness. Self-interest, which Fenelon saw as a form of self-love, is the paramount theological problem, in his view, because the selfish will not love but for their own interest. In other words, he sees it as an oxymoron, sundering them from their communion with God, which is the purest form of love. In the maxims of the love for God, these are servile love, concupiscent love, hopeful love, interested love, which prefers God, and the pur amour, or perfect charity. He condemns all of the lower forms of love, which are alloyed with self-love, and in which God is at best love as a means to a purely selfish end, salvation. But this is entirely inappropriate in Fenelon's view, for God ought to be loved for non-instrumental reasons. Importantly, even lower forms of religious love cannot serve as intermediate steps towards higher religiosity. Belief motivated by self-interest is ultimately self-defeating. For Fenelon, disinterestedness cannot be valued instrumentally, even as a corollary for salvation. The idea of disinterested love directed towards personal salvation is contradictory. This is a almost direct critique of Blaise Pascal and the notion of Pascal's wager, which effectively puts forward a pragmatic solution to the proof of God's existence, which is that the benefits that accrue from belief are so great that it will be illogical to deny the existence of God. Yeah, by that same token, Fenelon is essentially describing that as the abyss of worshipping God. It becomes completely contradictory because you are seeking God for the sake of the salvation of the self, not in terms of coming to a communion with God. And in terms of really underlining the severity of what Fenelon really means by love, it's something that Telemachus will encounter again and again in terms of the misery which Mentor, the guise of Athena, presents to him again and again. Just look at Minos and his judgment for the absence of divine reverence, and looking at the folly of the praises of men in terms of how this contrasts with the pure love of God and the severity of pure love. Minos, for reference, is the great king of Crete. In terms of the laws he made and in terms of his position in the afterlife, Minos is basically held up as a great royal archetype. And when we finally arrive at Crete in the story, as Telemachus is embarking upon all these adventures, he has an abortive trip to Sicily, he visits Egypt, he visits Tyre in Phoenicia, he visits Cyprus, he visits Crete, and there in Crete he sees perhaps again the most exalted of all the Greek kingdoms under essentially the legacy of the great king Minos. Minos said, "You are approached for nothing with regard to men, but did you not owe less to men than to the gods?" This again is holding a man in judgment. "What is then this justice of which you boast? You failed in no obligation to men who are nothing. You were virtuous, but you related all of your virtue to yourself and not to the gods who had given it to you. For you wanted to enjoy the fruits of your own virtue and confine it to yourself, hence Fenelon's conception of the self-interested love. You were your deity, but the gods who created everything and who were created nothing for themselves cannot renounce their rights. You forgot them. They will forget you. They will deliver you over to yourselves, since you wanted to be yours and not theirs. Seek therefore now, if you can, your consolation in your own heart. Here you are forever separated from these men you wanted to please. Here you are alone with yourself, who was your idol. Learn that there is no virtue without the respect and love for the gods to whom all is owed. Your false virtue, which has long dazzled men easy to deceive, will be confounded. Men only judging vices and virtues by what shocks them, or by what conveniences them, are blind, not only about the gods, but about evil. Here a divine light upends all the superficial judgments of theirs. It often condemns what they admire and justifies what they condemn." In other words, there is no correlation to be found in terms of purely seeking out, again, praise for its own sake and the opinions and the gratification of men if they seem again fickle and transitory compared to the eternal principles of believing in God. And for that sin of selfishness, as far as Fenelon is concerned, again, it is treated with the greatest level of severity. I mean, just look at what Odysseus says to Telemachus. This is a memory of Telemachus before Odysseus goes off to fight in the Trojan Wars. The last thing he remembers of his father. "O my son, may the gods preserve me from ever seeing you again. May rather the scissors of the spinner cut the thread of your days when it is barely formed, just as the reaper cuts with his scythe a tender flower that is beginning to open up. May my enemies crush you before your mother's eyes and mine, should you one day become corrupt and abandon virtue." Again, if you're going to look at this as an instance of tough love, the abandonment of virtue and the whole notion that Fenelon has towards paternity and education. For the child effectively to become corrupted, in many ways renounces some form of obligation from the parent, and this is the most severe iteration of that Odysseus would rather to see his son murdered in front of his and his mother's eyes rather than see him become a corrupted and dissolute individual. And indeed, when reading this, Odysseus's warning to Telemachus, it reminded me of what the Queen of France, Blanche of Castile, once said to Saint Louis, Louis IX, the King of France. I love you, my dear son, as much as a mother can love a child, but I would rather see you dead at my feet than should you ever commit a mortal sin. Then we come to the notion of freedom, which is to be found in this idea of this disinterested love, or again, the lack of a love, the love which is without self-interest. Again, I'm going to probably be tripping up over my terms here, but I'm trying to emphasize essentially the core principle of a love that is selfless. And this is in Telemachus in response to a series of debates held by the legal guardians of that great king Minos on Crete. And Telemachus is responding to the question of who in life is truly free. The freest of men is the one who can be free even in slavery. Wherever and in whatever station he may be, he is very free provided he reveres the gods, and he reveres only them. The man truly free is the one released from all fear and all desire, only bows to the gods and to his reason. Again, everything comes back not only to a Christianized version of God, but also to Athena. A lot of people, I would say quite rightly, have used this to presage the terms of the Enlightenment, which is again illumination, the illumination of reason. But what the Enlightenment does, and especially Voltaire and what I referenced earlier with Frederick II's Anti-Machiavel, Voltaire makes his mission not only the ridicule, but you can say the moral delegitimation of the Catholic Church and superstition. And so in that way, Fenelon and Voltaire are almost ideological opposites, despite us, again, espousing this love of reason for its own sake. But again, it's very fatalistic in a way. There is no true sort of authority on earth, whether it impose slavery or whatever, again, man-made principles are going to be thrust upon you. If you believe in God, essentially, you are truly free, and you will not be sundered to whatever station or whatever power constrains you. And indeed, later on in the novel, we see Mentor state this: what men call grandeur, glory, power, deep politics seem to these supreme deities as only misery and weakness. Now we come to the purpose of Telemachus. Telemachus repeats so often the theme of the folly of the protagonist's youth and the need for counsel, the need for mentor for Athena. This is Telemachus's role, the book's role, in terms of serving a prince's education. Indeed, Fenelon's work his Telemachus is a double entendre, for Fénelon is playing the role of mentor to his own student, the Duke of Burgundy, the second in line at that time to the throne of France and expected to be King of France one day. Alas, he was the king who never was. The Duke of Burgundy is Telemachus. It was intended for the Duke of Burgundy. It wasn't intended to reach a wide audience so long as Fenelon was alive. It formed part of a very intimate dynastic education for the young prince. Indeed, this is a very interesting segment taken from a memoir of Fenelon in the Lives of the Ancient Philosophers. The book I'm referencing is linked in the description. Fenelon entered upon his important office with religious solicitude, regarding the happiness of millions as connected with the disposition of his pupils, the training them to virtue, and especially forming the character of the eldest, who was destined to one day ascend to the throne of France, that being the Duke of Burgundy, became the subject of his most anxious thoughts, his noblest ambitions. The Duke of Burgundy was one of those singular beings who appear equally qualified by nature for the most exalted virtue or the most degraded vice, and whose bias depends entirely on the hand with which it may be given. At the time that Fenelon undertook the direction of him, it must be acknowledged that the preponderance towards the Duke was unpromising. The Duke of Burgundy, said the Duc de Saint-Simon in his memoirs, was born terrible, and during his first years continued to be an object of terror to those around him, hard-hearted, angry to the extreme of passion, even against inanimate objects. impetuous to a degree of fury, incapable of bearing the least opposition to his wishes, even from time or climate, without putting himself in paroxysms of rage that made one tremble for his existence, a condition in which he would demonstrate stubbornness in the highest degree, insatiability in the pursuit of every kind of pleasure, addicted to gratifications of the table and violent hunting, delighted to a degree of ecstasy with music, and which deep play in which, however, he could not bear to lose, and by his violence made it dangerous to anyone who would engage him. In fine, abandoned to all the passions, transported to every kind of enjoyment, often ferocious, naturally cruel, barbarous in his raillery, seizing the ridiculous with astonishing justice, high as the clouds in his own opinion, considering other men as atoms to which he bore no resemblance, and regarding even his brothers, though educated on an equality with him, only as intermediate beings between him and the rest of the human race. Such is the picture of this prince by one who was personally acquainted with him from his cradle, that being Saint-Simon. Take that, and doesn't that represent, isn't that the epitome of the Telemachus which Odysseus was essentially not threatening but warning to smite in front of his mother, the young prince who had abandoned all virtue? But here we have the entry of Fenelon. Happily, his talents bore full proportion to his faults, and under the exquisite discernment and judicious tenderness of Fenelon, who felt almost a parental attachment for his royal pupil, and whose plans were fully entered into with the aid of his coadjutors, the Abbé de Fleury, the Abbé de Langeron, and Father Levallois, the prince gradually became all that he could have wished. From the abyss which I have described, says Saint-Simon, there arose a prince, affable, gentle, moderate, patient, modest, humble, austere only to himself, attentive to his duties, and sensible to their great extent. His only object appeared to be to acquit himself of all that might be expected of him, as soon and subject, and to qualify himself for all his future obligations. Returning to the novel, Telemachus begins in media res, in the beginning of the setting, and he is recounting his adventures. He is on the island of Aegea, the island of the goddess Calypso. There he gets involved in many misadventures, essentially Calypso, as with Odysseus, trying to tempt this young, handsome man made in the image of the father from essentially becoming subsumed or corrupted by the idea of what Fenelon describes as voluptuousness, surrendered to the goddess as an act essentially of pure gratification and pleasure. But even in that situation, Telemachus is drawn to the other nymphs in her service, such as Eucharis. But it's here again that Fenelon is emphasizing through Mentor the folly of youth. Youth is presumptuousness. It expects everything of itself alone, though fragile, it believes it can do everything and never have anything to fear. It confides lightly and without precaution. Distrust yourself and always wait for counsel. Again, you can see that within the novel, Fenelon is actually echoing his own experience with the prince. Indeed, Telemachus goes on to recount to Calypso a dark tempest. Telemachus had sought to sail straight to Sicily, where there was a rumor that Odysseus had traveled, despite the warnings of Mentor that there were Trojans, which had just been fighting a 10-year war with the Greeks, and indeed Cyclops. Mentor had advised against this, but Telemachus, foolhardy, decided to go straight into the tempest, and in response he says, "My dear Mentor, why did I refuse to follow your counsel? Was I not unfortunate to have wanted to believe myself at an age when one has neither foresight of the future, nor experience of the past, nor the restraint to manage the present? I distrust myself as my most dangerous enemy. It is you, Mentor, whom I will always believe, to which Mentor cautions that he will relapse, inevitably, before returning to wisdom." Indeed, I want to take this opportunity again to really underscore, one could argue, the severity to which the prince was treated. Some have even regarded this, contemporaries and people looking at Fenelon from, you can say, perhaps a less sympathetic perspective, as not simply enchantment or success in education, but indoctrination. And Sanford b. Kanter, in an article which is very widely cited by Fenelon students, the Archbishop's political activity, the focal point of dynasticism, stresses, you can say, this cynical point towards indoctrination. Fénelon achieved a complete dominance over the Duke of Burgundy, with the boy's mother dead and with the Dauphin more interested in the joys of the hunt than in his son. Fénelon, as both tutor and director of conscience, became Burgundy's centre of life. And again, echoing the memoirs of Saint-Simon, he basically became a father. The intensity and all the pervasiveness of his education of Burgundy are perhaps unequalled in history. In addition to constant confrontation with a personality whose force had strongly impressed adults, Burgundy was made the subject of prearranged scenes in which people, a workman on a scaffolding, for example, would suddenly say something wise to the young prince. And when Burgundy sought out Fenelon to remark upon the strange event, Fenelon would be prepared to offer the supplementary remark to round out the lesson. Indeed, when reading that, I was completely gobsmacked at the length to which Burgundy effectively was duped to believe that he was essentially living in his own adventures of Telemachus. For reference, Zeus, Athena, Ares, you see this in the Iliad, you see this in the Odyssey. So much of the encounters of the mortals, I mean, the whole premise of the Odyssey begins with a grudge held by Poseidon against Odysseus. The gods utilize mortals and they influence them in subtle and sometimes very explicit ways, even in terms of the wars, conflicts that Telemachus will become involved in terms of his defense of Salente or Salentum. Often Athena and Zeus will say, for example, bestow him with divine prowess, divine pieces of weaponry, armor. And in this case, Fénelon is almost trying to assume the role of Athena in terms of placing individuals at certain points from which, again, he can impress the ideas of the goddess of wisdom. And to see again that this was almost a literal reenactment, again, just shows the extremity to which Fénelon would go in terms of realizing these adventures in real life. If ever a solitary moment was allowed Burgundy, he had literature, especially written for him by Fénelon. The pressure was unrelenting. Fénelon took an egocentric child, given over to rages and tantrums, and broke his will, hammered him into a scholarly, self-effacing monk. The transformation was profound and the subservience lasting. At first, seeming to be maturing of a prince under the guidance of an intelligent, kind, and pious man, this change was greeted with joy. But as Burgundy's complete helplessness and utter dependence became indisputable, he became the object of scorn and derision. Indeed, if you look at the fact that in the earlier segment where Telemachus is recounting the experience of the Tempest, where he is bemoaning the fact again that his youth essentially condemns him to these rash mistakes, and he has to always rely this recourse always to counsel, lapse and returning to wisdom, that Fénelon has very much placed himself in that role to be the king's eternal counselor. And he himself, you can say, perhaps Fénelon took this and believed that he was trying to humbly impart an aspect of Athena's wise counsel. Indeed, everything that we know about Fénelon attests to the fact that despite the severity of his moral pronouncements, he was an incredibly humble and modest man. He wasn't, say, for example, had any intention of starting a revolution, despite all of his cryptic criticisms of Louis XIV. But nevertheless, the effect, you can say the trance, effectively the spell which Fénelon was able to cast on the young prince was so effective, you can say, as a result of this unrelenting education, that others basically saw that Fénelon was actually becoming what Fénelon himself would so rigorously despise, which is that of the evil counselor. That is definitely not a view I hold, but it's a view you have to understand that contemporaries at the time felt. Indeed, in caustic rhymes, the Duke of Burgundy was ridiculed for a piety that had effectively unmanned him. "What, my prince," they said to him, "do you mean to let Lille be taken?" This during the War of the Spanish Succession, where he was made a high-ranking commander. "Oh, indeed," he replied, "why not? I would rather lose a city than see my men die in battle without confession." True to this godly nature, at the battle of Oudenarde, the prince withdrew into a windmill, praying to God to watch over his troops and to save the souls of the fallen who had not confessed. The Battle of Oudenarde, for reference, was a major French defeat under the Duke of Burgundy against the allied forces of the Duke of Marlborough, who would go on to build Blenheim Palace and sire the ancestry for Winston Churchill. But it is effectively a parody. It's a parody directed at the Duke and by extension trying to mock Archbishop Fenelon because of a disastrous series of communications in that battle between the two commanders, the Duke of Burgundy and the Comte de Vendôme, which led to Vendôme at one point in the battle to lead an unsupported attack against the Allied right wing. Here it's essentially been recast that the prince was too holy in terms of engaging in conflict. And if you read Telemachus, despite the constant emphasis and the primacy of peace, which resounds throughout the entire work, at no point is Telemachus or even Mentor a pacifist. Culminating in terms of these admonitions against the vices of youth and looking at the vices of the young prince himself, we arrive in the story at a hedonistic festival held at Cythera Temple on Cyprus before Mentor finally returns to Telemachus and encourages him to flee. At first, I, Telemachus, was horrified, but imperceptibly I became accustomed to it. Vice no longer frightened me. This again in response to a lewd festival, which was basically becoming a public orgy. The gathering inspired an inexplicable inclination for disorder in me. They mocked my innocence, my restraint, my modesty. Education no longer sustained me. O gods who cruelly toy with men, why do you make them pass through this age? That is a time of madness and blazing fever. And Mentor in response, the air one breathes is pestilent. The contagious men only speak to each other in order to spread a mortal venom, craven and infamous voluptuousness, which is the most horrible of the evils released from Pandora's box, softens all hearts and tolerates no virtue. Indeed, this emphasis on vice is confirmed in Fenelon's directions for the conscience of the king. Vice is in itself a contagious poison. Human nature is always liable to the contamination. It is ever ready to break the yoke of modesty. A spark causes a flame. So what is the solution? The solution, as was referenced at the beginning in terms of the pure immutable light, is always to return to wisdom. And here, Mentor and the judges, the legal guardians, the jurists of the great King Minos of Crete are deliberating, and Telemachus responds. What perfected their reasoning was the calmness of their minds, Telemachus reflecting, delivered from mad passions and the whims of youth. Wisdom alone acted in them, the fruits of their long virtue taming their humours to enjoy noble pleasures of listening to reason. Unhappy youth was so impetuous and so distant from that virtue, so enlightened and so tranquil. Again, if you're going to get rather meta in terms of assessing this, you can either look at this and say that this is the sort of attitude, the veneration of wisdom, of age, that the Archbishop is trying to cultivate in his student, again, from a Christian point of view, in terms of going back to the reverence of thy father and thy mother, a very sound and consistent theme. But you can read this cynically and say that Telemachus is being, as again some unsympathetic readers, effectively indoctrinated to see his salvation in the form of Fénelon. And we arrive finally at greatness and Mentor, by extension Thena's assessment of what greatness is. Greatness, like the greatness of Odysseus, is acquired through patience. Softness corrupts princes, pridefulness intoxicates them. Be content if you can overcome your misfortunes and remember them. As the master of men, remember you have been weak, you have been poor, and you have suffered like them. Again, the emphasis has always been in Telemachus that humility, to return to the tranquil life, to live as other men, to be a farmer, is a wonderful education. To be a soldier, to be a farmer, to live in poverty, to have modesty. The further away you are from vanity, the closer you are to the simple life, the more you are reminded of your own mortality, the more again akin to majesty you are in the estimation of Mentor in Telemachus. But patience, again, it's the futility of understanding that youthfulness is often actually treated here as there's a tragedy associated with youth, which you'll rarely see from any modern authors, in the sense that youth, but in and of itself, encourages one to err, it encourages one to vice, it is not tempered by wisdom. And so the only recourse for this tragedy of youth is to wait, is to accede to the passage of time, and to accept that with age comes wisdom. Regarding, again, the emphasis of the jurists, the legal guardians on Crete of the king of King Minos, this comes to the idea of how Athena, Mentor, looks at the law. Mentor to Telemachus says this: he, the king, has complete authority over the peoples, but the laws have complete authority over him. He has absolute power to do good, but his hands are tied as soon as he wants to do evil. The lords entrust him to the peoples, and they are the most precious of all trusts. Effectively, again, you can say this is presaging the whole idea of the rule of law. The rule of law is entrusted to the king by the peoples. It is held as a trust. It is not something that can be brazenly violated or tampered with in order to pursue essentially whatever ends the king has in mind. This is where kingship evolves from legitimacy to usurpation, and indeed to tyranny. If there is the absolute power, it exists to do good. Again, the emphasis on sort of the continuation of the great laws of the predecessor, that being Minos of Crete. The law is handed down also. There is an element of the emphasis of conservationism in the law, and there's a timeless aspect to venerating the simple life and venerating the harvest. There is a tradition which is found in law, and the king is supposed to accept that tradition, as if, again, the tradition and the law itself represented the nation as a whole, to which, again, the king is a servant more than an overlord. Indeed, if you read Fenelon's dialogues with the dead, Solon, the great Athenian lawmaker, debates with Justinian, the great Roman emperor in Constantinople, on the merits of Justinian's Roman law. Fenelon actually insinuates through Solon that the great code of Justinian, the basis of so much of Roman law continuing on through the Middle Ages even to today, itself turns the law into a source of royal vanity. It is not a law for the people. It has in fact alienated the people through the law's complexity, and indeed the resulting need for interpreters of that law, for the need for lawyers. The complexity, the sophistication, the obscurity of the law actually renders the law a source of vanity in and of itself, and something which alienates that trust of the people. And indeed, I think if you're going to look at this from an Enlightenment mindset and the same mentality that informed the Code Napoleon, so much of the Enlightenment was based again on the simplicity and ready understanding of the laws. The more complicated, convoluted the legal system becomes, not only does it become again inaccessible in terms of popular understanding of what the law is, but it can also be corrupted when you again have legalistic interpretations and you abandon the spirit of the law. It becomes simply a matter of word games and sophistry. And just coming back again to another perceptive point by Mentor to Telemachus, you must inviolably keep these laws of Minos, and indeed present them for the education of children. So as, again, the laws are to be presented simply with clarity, so an understanding of the laws of the kingdom obviously naturally follows in terms of education. If there is an admonition against obscurantism, which is to prevent the light of understanding from individuals, hence to obscure, then Fénelon is resolutely anti-obscurantist. Public schools must be established where they teach the reverential awe of the gods, love of homeland, respect of the laws, the preference of honor over pleasures, and even over life itself. There must be magistrates who watch over the families and over the mores of private individuals. Watch over them yourself. You are the only king, the shepherd of the people. By doing so, you will prevent an infinite number of disorders and crimes, but those you are unable to prevent severely punish at the outset. It is a clemency to make examples that staunch the course of iniquity. A little blood, appropriately spilled, spares much afterwards. So again, despite all the claims of love, and as we're going to see, the repeated claims of peace, there is no pacifism here. There is no restraint in terms of the severity of enacting, enforcing the law. Not only do we, on the one hand, have a legal system which is readily understood and people are steeped in an understanding of tradition and the law, and that is the purpose of education, but the king has to be responsible for having a vigilance, not only as a shepherd, but as a guide over the people to ensure effectively that the magistracies, they are all continuing on in terms of the just application of these laws. There's actually an instance, I think it's in Chinese history, when the great, one of the great Tang emperors, Tang dynasty China, so this would have been about the 7th century, came into a Confucian examination room. Obviously in China, civil servants were assessed in terms of their understanding of the Confucian classics in order to fulfill their role in the service in the state. And he would sit in and deliberately mark and assess the quality of the exam students. So if you're again to look at this constant vigilance, understanding again the proper trust of the law, and to ensure that your officials essentially represent you and your just government, then looking at that example, I think is quite illustrative. But again, to quell disorders, to severely stamp out people who perpetrate crimes in order to show a greater clemency, a little blood appropriately spilled spares much afterwards. Again, especially to modern readers listening to that, especially given even in the Catholic Church, the last two popes have spoken out so much on against the death penalty, that again, Fénelon is unrelenting in terms of the need for severity and the need for capital punishment. But here it comes again in terms of echoing how I started this discussion, which was talking about Telemachus' passage to find Odysseus in the afterlife, to find Tartarus, to see the evil kings, to see the torments and their tortures against the Elysian examples of the kingship, which is essentially intoxicated in permanent joy. He uses two examples in the story in terms of communicating these through Telemachus's adventures, and this really expands upon this notion of the Machiavellian king, and indeed the anti-Machiavellian king. First of all, this is presented in Egypt, the anti-Machiavellian example. In Egypt, they are in abundance. They live happily and love the one to whom they owe all their happiness, this being Pharaoh. It is in this way, O Telemachus, Mentor added, that you must reign and make the joy of your peoples. Should the gods ever grant your possession of the kingdom of your father, love your peoples as your children, enjoy the pleasure of being loved by them, and make it so that they can never feel peace and joy without being reminded it is a good king who brought them those rich presents. Indeed, these are the quote-unquote just policies of the 22,000 cities of Pharaonic Egypt. The justice in Egypt is exercised in favor of the poor against the rich. The good education of children who are accustomed to obedience, work, sobriety, love of the manual arts, scholarship, exactness in all religious ceremonies, selflessness, the desire for honor, the fidelity to man, and all reverential awe of the gods, that each father inspired in his children. Happy are the people a wise king leads in this way, but even happier the king who makes the happiness of so many of his peoples, and who finds in his own virtue, in his own happiness in his virtue. Again, that is a repeated theme that really ends the story of Telemachus, when Telemachus is crushed by the responsibility that there has to be some resolution, some peace to be found in terms of the crushing sense of obligation and responsibility. And it's that this responsibility, which again is the absence of self-interest, is in itself the source of supreme happiness. And Mental goes on that Pharaoh or king Sesostris of Egypt listened each day at certain hours to all those subjects who had either complaints to make or advice indeed to offer him. He neither scorned or rebuked anyone, and believed himself king only in order to do good. So when Sesostris dies, the old men cry out, "Why must we survive the great king Sesostris?" The whole notion that people need to be reminded that it is this great king, in this instance Sesostris, who is responsible for the bounty, that has a distinctly political reasoning behind it. The foundation for a just and legal society, again, perpetuates the legitimacy of the regime, and in turn leads to greater social stability. On the one hand, you can say again that the elements of prosperity should be self-evident, but in terms of a sort of self-regulating regime, it all needs to come back to a connected whole which relates to the nation, a national community, the unity of mankind, and by extension, fidelity to the king who loves all like a father. So contrast this with Pygmalion, the king of Tyre, which Telemachus and Mentor visit next. It is a crime in Tyre to have great possessions. Avarice renders him, Pygmalion, suspicious. He persecutes the rich and fears the poor. It is an even greater crime to have virtue, for the good cannot tolerate Pygmalion's injustices. Everything agitates him. He is afraid of his own shadow. He is silent. He sighs. He heaves groans from deep within his heart. He cannot hide the remorse that is ripping his entrails apart. He never has a moment of assurance, despite the shedding of the blood of all those he fears. He does not see that the cruelty to which he entrusts himself will destroy him. Riches are as useless to him as sand, for he dares not touch them. He seems to be master of all other men, but he is not master of himself, for he has as many masters and executioners as he has violent desires. The wicked king is always exposed to gruesome death, even in his inaccessible palace surrounded by guards. Sesostris was safe in a crowd as a father surrounded by his family. And the emphasis here against Machiavelli's assertion that it is better to be feared than loved, Fenelon resolutely believes it is better to be loved than to be feared. Indeed, if you look at Pygmalion, you can look at this and draw many comparisons, of which Fenelon was not only familiar but wrote about. Louis XI of France being one such example, the universal spider, one which actually Machiavelli wrote about directly. Many kings and condottieri of Italy during the Italian wars, whether it be some of the dukes of Sforza, whether it be some of the Medici, King Fernando di Trastamara of Naples, whose death precipitated the invasion of Italy by France under Charles VIII, is one such example. I believe as a king, he surrounded himself in a gallery of his dead political competitors. He kept their bodies, he kept them dressed and placed them around a dinner table, and he showed them to visitors and guests. This is the fate that awaits all those who betray the great king of Naples. So you can almost say that this criticism is invested less in terms of a desire to see Pygmalion as a unique specimen of king, but rather Pygmalion is symbolic of a whole genre of kings that we see around the time, and all those examples which I just listed, which comes back to what the role of Telemachus is, which is that kingship is something to be earned. It's not something to be handed over. It's not something to be grasped at. Indeed, it's not even something that is necessarily inherited, because in the tale and indeed the tragedy that unfurls following the death of King Sesostris in Egypt, we follow the events of Pharaoh King Bacchorus. Bacchorus, son of the great Sesostris, had neither humaneness nor curiosity, nor esteem for virtue. He had been nurtured in a softness and a brutal pride. He counted men for nothing, believing they were created only for him. The name of Sesostris, so dear to the Egyptians, made them bear the craven and cruel conduct of his son, the son who was racing to his ruin. Again, the name of Sesostris, this you can say is a difficulty in terms of understanding the role of legitimacy and dynasty, is that dynasty has a way of reinforcing the rule of a particular family due to the exalted characteristics of the great forebear. In the case of France, Louis XI was that exemplar. Everything came back to him. Philip IV, you can say a far more ruthless and Machiavellian king, exploited the legacy of his sainted grandfather to great effect in terms of pursuing some incredibly controversial policies there and now. And so there is a warning here that dynasty is not something to be treated highly. It is something that, despite we are supposed to understand and look at Sesostris and, from the point of view of Mentor, understand that prosperity and the bounty of life is the result of a tranquil and loving king, that the king himself and his dynasty, his name, has created the conditions for tolerating what ought, in any other situation with a less stable regime, ought to be intolerable. So it comes to revolt in Egypt, even in spite of the legitimacy of Sesostris and his dynasty. Streams of blood flowed around Bacchorus. The wheels of his chariot were stained with a black blood, thick and foaming. Barely could they roll over the heaps of crushed corpses. The young king, well-built, vigorous, of a proud and haughty mien, had fury and despair in his eyes. His courage pushed him haphazardly. He knew neither how to mend his errors nor to anticipate the evils that were threatening him. His intelligence equaled his courage, but he had never been instructed by bad fortune. The least resistance inflamed his anger then. No longer could be reasoned. He was beside himself, transformed into a ferocious beast. His natural goodness and right reasoning abandoned him in an instant, and his most loyal servants were reduced to flight, forcing all good people to detest his mad conduct. And this repeats another theme which Telemachus gets across. Valor can only be a virtue to the extent that it is ruled by prudence. Otherwise, it is a senseless scorn for life and a brutal ardor. The instance again of Bacchorus is to show that in any other situation, if this man who had many natural qualities, physical strength and intelligence, were given an opportunity to prove these natural assets, either in terms of facing a foreign invasion or from a point of view of great personal tragedy and austerity, rising to assume the point of kingship through, you can say, a process of election and adoration, or indeed, kind of like the prodigal son, returning and trying to win the respect of the father, that he would have been worthy for the kingship. But having inherited the position and having fallen into vice, and Sesostris not having disowned his son, leads to the situation where the softness and the arrogance of the king, like a young Duke of Burgundy, has led to the great misfortune of Egypt. The insinuation here is that Sesostris, if he's to be held up as the great anti-Machiavel archetype of kingship, he himself is responsible for the creation of Bacchorus because he did not do what Odysseus threatened to do to Telemachus, which is to smite him in the eyes of his mother should he ever fall from the graces of virtue. Again, the theme of how a king is made is returned with the idea of Aristodemus. Crete, when Telemachus and Mentor arrive there, is without a king. Aristodemus is proposed to be the new king. Aristodemus had been a soldier. He had offered the previous king, King Idomeneus the Wise, which is actually featured in this painting, wise counsel, which he spurned, the king. Aristodemus was a Cretan patriot. He was a just father. He had rewarded one son, and he had treated another son who had again fallen foul of this idea of virtue severely. He had been rejected by King Idomeneus. He had been left in poverty and effectively internal exile during the Trojan Wars, lest he be given the opportunity to rival Idomeneus in battle glory. So he was called on to the kingship by the elders of Minos, the keeper of that great kingly archetype. And in response, Aristodemus would accept the kingship on 3 conditions. That I will quit the kingship in 2 years if I do not render you better off than you are, and if you are resistant to the laws. Second, that I will be free to continue a simple and frugal life. And third, that my children will have no rank after my death, that they will be treated without distinction, according to their merit, like the rest of the citizens. In other words, kind of like a Roman consul, he is prepared to take a time limit on his term if, again, he's seeming to be failing in his duty of kingship. And indeed, if the people resist the laws, that is an implicit assumption that the laws which the king is creating are themselves unjust. Hence why I place so much emphasis on what Mentor has to say about the law, that the law is a trust which is to be held between the people and their king. And if the laws are seen to be unjust, then the kingship itself unravels. And so his remedy to that is accept a term limit. This emphasis on the frugal life is concurrent with so many themes on severity and domestic simplicity, the value of poverty. You can say again, even priestly poverty in life that will prevent a king becoming corrupted by the need to seek out earthly pleasures, or what Fenelon refers to as voluptuousness. And then finally, the fact that the children will have no rank. The idea again is that Sesostris' great error was in confirming Bacchorus king by the right of his dynasty, by the right of birth. If his children are going to have any rights to the kingship, they have to be seen from the perspective of the rest of people as nothing other than virtuous citizens, and it is as a virtuous citizen, not as children of the king, that they bear any right to be elected to the position of kingship. Again, take this in the context of 17th century, 18th century France and Europe. It accords with many of the constitutions that we see in Greece at the time. Fenelon was an avid reader of Aristotle and the Politics. The Politics is a comparative survey of the many constitutions and quote-unquote regimes, and a comparative and qualitative reference between them, and seeing the elevated forms of a government, aristocracy, and the denigrated forms of a government, oligarchy, as with monarchy, which is turned into tyranny. So when Fenelon is speaking, when he's trying to find these instructive lessons, which again, it should be mentioned, these are all designed to inform the education of someone who is meant to become the King of France, that he is using classical examples and a idea of constitutional history, which is Greco-Roman. It is not founded in recent medieval or early modern history. And if you look at, again, his example of Solon, the great lawmaker of Athens, chastising the great sainted, it should be mentioned, Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian, it should again place so much emphasis that Fenelon values the profane virtue, civilizational virtues, political virtues of antiquity over than, you can say, many of the more recent examples in political history that we see, which makes Fenelon in some ways a template for political revolutionaries who want to tear the system down, which is definitely not what Fenelon wants to achieve. The final notion, which is to really arrive at, which is, this is dynasty contrasted with monarchy by election. And then finally, when it comes to Idomeneus, the king who had been deposed from Crete, we talk about the idea of oikos, of home. Idomeneus still lived. During this time when Fenelon was writing, so this is the 1690s, there had been the quote-unquote glorious revolution in England. William of Orange had deposed James II, and James II lived in France. He was received by Fenelon, and Fenelon was a tutor to James, who claimed to be James III, the old pretender. So despite the fact that there are examples in which he was living with of a deposed king, in Telemachus, that is Idomeneus, Idomeneus has been deprived of his rule in Crete, but he has been replaced. And from the point of view of Athena, he has been replaced justly. So there is no trace of royal legitimism here. Again, dynasty is not a factor in Telemachus, which justifies the state of a ruling king. Idomeneus has no right to come back and claim his kingship simply because he had been king at one point, nor his sons by that same token. So for mentor, for Athena, when I'm using the term mentor and Athena, I do so interchangeably because they're the same person. The only difference is that mentor is an aspect which has been presented to Telemachus. Only does mentor reveal herself as Athena at the end of the story. Do the two personalities finally coalesce into the godly Athena. But from the point of view of mentor Athena, Idomeneus has been rightly deprived of his kingship, but he is not left without the prospect of a return to royalty, or indeed redemption for all of the mistakes he made in Crete. But before I get to that, because it forms such a major backdrop for the novel, I want to talk about Telemachus himself, on his own monarchy and his conception of home. Although I may have never governed, I have learnt through the laws and through wise men who made them how arduous it is to lead cities and kingdoms. I am therefore content with poor Ithaca, though it may be small and poor. I will have enough glory, provided I reign there with justice, piety, and courage, even though I may not reign there too soon. Telemachus is offered, you can say, many opportunities to assume the kingship, to put himself forward, to be king of Crete, to be king of the Daunians, to even be king of Salentum. All of these kingships would be glorious compared to little Ithaca. So it's not just a simple matter of talking about someone who was born to the kingship or someone who's elected to the kingship. But in the case of Ithaca, it's the same with the story of Odysseus. The story is about the return to the king. The Trojan War is a parable for the great disorders that occur to Greek civilization following the departure of all of these great lawmakers and all of these fathers to go off to fight essentially what is a pointless war against Troy. And the return, the delayed return, again, is symptomatic of the fact that the war has alienated the monarchs from their people, and there needs to be a restitution. And indeed, Telemachus is following the themes of Odysseus here, that when he returns to Ithaca, when he returns to his little kingdom, he has no right of it simply by being the son of Odysseus. He has to come back and he has to prove himself worthy of it. He has to mend Ithaca. He has to restore prosperity and peace. Otherwise, he will find himself deposed like Idomeneus, or overthrown and killed like Bacchus. There are immense responsibilities. And indeed, I think the emphasis that Telemachus is content and indeed humbled to the point that he will accept Ithaca as his kingdom and nothing more, no great conquests await him, is a notion again that seeking a greater, more expansive kingdom for the point of view of the story is pointless. What glory there is to be found in kings is the joy of ruling for its own sake. And the reward is to be found in death. It is not to be found in life, which conversely, again, from a very sort of strictly Christian point of view, is a form, you can say, of the acceptance that one is already dead. So these themes move on to a persistent idea, which is evil counsel and the notion of betrayal. What I find so fascinating about Fénelon and reading Telemachus is that many figures historically and indeed even today will excuse the actions of certain politicians or nobles or monarchs because of evil counsel given. The king is never at fault. It is always the ministers who intrigue against this king. But for Fenelon, he puts so much emphasis on the king being responsible for his ministers and not vice versa. The king is not granted the ability to abdicate all responsibility because he has surrounded himself by corrupt ministers. It shouldn't be incumbent upon a popular revolution, as was often the case in medieval and indeed more modern society, to depose a government in order to deliver the king. Rather, the king should have delivered his people from evil governments. I mean, I always go back to a quote by Franz Joseph of Austria: "My role is to spare my people from their governments." That is the Fénelon mantra, effectively. Evil counsel and the notion of being corrupted by ministers will not save you, will not save your reign. You can say again, there is a pragmatic instruction to be gained here, but so much of the story of Telemachus, the instruction to the prince, is focused on the idea of spotting these men. So Mentor says, even the wisest kings are often taken in. Artful, self-serving men surround them. The good withdraw because they are neither eager to please nor flatterers. The good wait until they are sought, and princes hardly know how to seek them. Fenelon actually is speaking about his own experiences with Louis XIV. So, for example, he writes his letter to Louis XIV during the height of the 9 Years' War, which is one of the incessant wars of the reign of Louis XIV. In that letter, he makes very harsh criticisms of the reign, but he doesn't send it, nor does he appeal to a public constituency in order to agitate the king change his opinion. Rather, he waits to be sought out by the king, to have his opinion rendered, and from the point of view of Fenelon, that doesn't occur, so he never sends the letter. In contrast, the wicked are bold, deceitful, eager to insinuate themselves and to please, adroit dissimulation, to do anything against honor and conscience, to satisfy the passions of the one who reigns. He is lost if he does not repulse. Which I think is a very clear, concise instruction to recognize and then to repulse. And this all revolves around the redemption of the mediocre king, the deposed king of Crete, Idomeneus. Idomeneus had been a Greek general at Troy, and part of his deposition and exile was thanks to his dependency on wicked counselors such as Protesilas and such as Timocrates. And here, again, this rather lengthy section, Idomeneus talks about his misfortune, effectively, of having to deal with a figure like Protesilas, and indeed the bizarre psychological position, the crutch that one has in terms of relying on evil ministers when Protesilas is brought back into the favor of the king, despite the fact having already abandoned him and perhaps again led him to his exile and his newly found kingship in the south of Italy, in Salentum to begin with, where he's fighting a war. "Are you surprised," Mentor said to Telemachus, "that the most estimable men are still men and still show some remnants of the foibles of humanity amidst the innumerable traps and impediments inseparable from kingship? Idomeneus, it is true, has been nourished in the ideas of splendor and haughtiness, but what philosopher would have been able to protect himself from flattery had he been in his place? It is true that he allowed himself to be thwarted by those of which he had his confidence, but the wisest kings are often deceived, whatever precautions they take not to be. A king cannot do without his ministers who unburden him, and in whom he trusts, since he cannot do everything. Besides, a king knows much less than the private individuals do of men who surround him. They are always masked alongside him. They exhaust all sorts of artifices to deceive him. Alas, dear Telemachus, you will experience it only too much. One does not find in men either the virtues or the talents one seeks in them. No matter how hard we study and dig deep, we are disappointed every day. There never comes an end in making the best of men. Do what you need them to do for the public good. You have their headiness, their incompatibilities, their jealousies. One hardly persuades them nor corrects them. The more people one has to govern, the more ministers are needed to do through them what one cannot do himself, and the more one needs men to whom authority is entrusted, the more one is exposed to be mistaken in such choices. Such a merciless critic of kings today who govern tomorrow much less well than they, and would make the same errors along with infinitely greater ones, if the same power were entrusted in him. The private station, should a man combine it with a little wit to speak well, covers all natural faults, highlights dazzling talents, and makes a man appear worthy of every position from which he is far removed. But it is authority that puts all talents to a severe test and reveals great faults. Grandeur is like certain glasses that enlarge every object. All faults appear to grow in those high places where the last things have great consequence and where the slightest errors have violent repercussions. The entire world is busy observing a single man at all hours and judging him with extreme rigor. Those who judge him have no experience in the position he holds. They do not appreciate the difficulties of it, and they no longer desire him to be a man as much as they demand perfection of him. So, even though Fenelon is completely severe in terms of his expectations and his pronouncements made against kings who fall foul of his conception of virtue, which again he believes is the divine conception of virtue, that he is also willing to accept the notion of redemption, that a man, regardless of his mediocrities and his failings, if he is willing to accept and desires again to improve the state of his reign, that he should be encouraged and he should not be demonized. This whole notion again of the perfectibility of kingship is implicit in Kantorovitz and the king's two bodies, which is the idea again that the king must be the optimal man, he must be the optimus homo, and that perfection is sought and expected by the people. But at the same time, one has to accept that even though perfection is always the goal, perfection, especially earthly perfection, is actually impossible beyond the pursuit, and that you can't expect mortals to act as if they were gods. And so you shouldn't always reserve the worst judgments to them if they intend to do good things. A king, however good and wise he may be, is still a man. His mind has limits and his virtue has them too. He has moods, passions, habits of which he is not entirely the master. He is obsessed ever by self-interested and artful people. He does not find the help he seeks. He falls each day into some miscalculation, at times through his passions and at times through those of his ministers. No sooner has he mended an error than he falls into another. Such is the condition of the most enlightened and most virtuous kings. Sorry to end with such just a banal point, but I have to have the fan on during these conversations. I tried to turn the fan off last time and I nearly had a heat stroke. And unfortunately, my fan will occasionally make a little bit of a creaky noise. So if you hear that coming through, please do bear with me. I don't have the option of turning it off. The longest and best reigns are too short and too imperfect to mend in the end what one has spoiled without wanting to in the beginning. Kingship carries with it all these miseries. Human impotence succumbs under the crushing of a burden. One must pity kings and excuse them. Are they not to be pitied for having to govern so many men, whose needs are infinite, and who give so much difficulty to those who want to govern well? Frankly speaking, men are greatly to be pitied in having to be governed by a king who is only a man like them, for it would require gods to redress them. But kings are to be pitied no less, being only men, that is to say, wise and imperfect in having to govern this countless multitude of corrupt and deceiving men. Telemachus retorted, Idomeneus lost through his error the kingdom of his ancestors in Crete, and without your counsel he would have lost a second one, this new kingdom in the south of Italy, which is Salentum. I confess, resumed Mentor, that he made great errors, Idomeneus, but seek in Greece and all the better governed countries a king who has not made inexcusable errors. The greatest men have in their temperament and the character of their mind faults that lead them astray, and the most laudable are those who have the courage to know, to mend their waywardness. Do you think that Odysseus, the great Odysseus, your father, who was the model for the kings of Greece, would not have his weakness and his faults too? If Athena had not led him step by step,
How many times would he have succumbed in the perils of the predicaments where fortune toyed with him? How many times did Athena have to restrain or address him in order to lead him to glory by the paths of virtue? Do not even expect, when you see him reigning with so much glory in Ithaca, to find him without imperfections. You will see them in him, undoubtedly. Greece, Asia, and all the islands of the sea admired him despite the faults of 1,000 marvelous qualities. Make them forget. You will be only too happy to be able to acquire them and to study them unceasingly as your model. Accustom yourself then, O Telemachus, to only expect of the greatest men what humanity is capable of doing. Youth in experience delivers itself over to a presumptuous criticism, which disgusts it with all the models it needs to follow, and throws it into an incurable indocility. Not only must you love, respect, imitate your father, though he may not be perfect, but you must also have high esteem for Idomeneus, despite all that I have corrected in him, this being Mentor. Mentor effectively leaves the goal of Salentum with having, quote unquote, the greatest laws and the most prosperous kingdom in all of the Mediterranean. He is naturally sincere, upright, fair, open-handed, and beneficent. He is the model of valor. He detests fraud when he knows of it, and he freely follows the true leanings of his heart. All is apparent. Talents are great and proportionate to his rank. His simplicity in confessing his wrongs, his gentleness, his patience in allowing me to say the harshest things, his courage to publicly mend his errors, and in doing so put himself above all criticism of men, show a truly great soul. Good fortune, or the counsel of others, can preserve a very mediocre man from certain errors. But there is only an extraordinary virtue that can push a king so long seduced by flattery to mend his wrongs, even if it more glorious to pick oneself up again in this way than to have ever fallen. Idomeneus has made the errors almost all kings make, but almost no king does it in order to correct himself as he himself has just done. The emphasis, again, in terms of this Christian reimagining of Homer, is that Christianity is about renovation and it is about redemption. Yes, the implications of kingship in Telemachus are extreme, yet at the same time, one should not fault certain individuals who are mortal as if they were effectively kings. And even the ignominy of having been deposed, having been dispossessed of Crete, and again, Mentor Athena looking at that and saying that that has to be accepted. Aristodemus is now king, and he is the rightful king. Idomeneus has no claim, and his heirs have no claim on the seat of his ancestors. He has found a new kingdom which make, and now he has to improve and make that state prosperous. And the positive implications of the fable is that finally he does so. But Idomeneus will make the same mistakes. In particular, he will make a mistake of which someone like Fenelon was intimately acquainted with, which is the addiction to a certain form of government, validamento, the love of a favorite, the love of the valido. In Spain, during the, you can say, final decades of the Golden Age, King Philip IV of Spain was governed by Duke Olivares, who effectively ran the country whilst Philip IV became an ornament. Simultaneously, Cardinal Richelieu, and then for the regency, it should be mentioned of Louis XIV, Cardinal Mazarin ran the kingdoms for their respective kings. Louis XIII is always effectively seen as a puppet of Cardinal Richelieu. Likewise, King James I of England had his own valido, which was the Duke of Buckingham. So as far as Fénelon is concerned, Protesilas is this quintessential valido. And as you can basically tell by the consummate sort of relationship that these favorites have with their kings, in some cases it's often insinuated that there's even a sexual component to the nature of government by the favorite, that it's almost impossible to break that trance if the valido is essentially using the king, in the case of the Duke of Buckingham or Olivares, Richelieu to a much lesser extent, to serve his own ambition. In the case of Richelieu, he will always emphasize that he does everything he does for the glory and the stability of the Kingdom of France, despite being a cardinal. And this comes back to Idomeneus' own valido in Protesilaus, who is, in spite of his known ambition, come essentially in order to become corrupted again by this favorite. I, Idomeneus, told myself, if one makes a great row in order to get out of the hands of one corrupt man, only to fall into those of some other. In other words, he's basically trying to find an excuse that he is such a poor judge of character that in all events he will simply fall into the hand of another corrupt advisor. So why not deal essentially with the devil he knows? A rather cynical reading of it. Idomeneus, I was too hostile to affairs, too distracted to be able to pull myself from his hands, Protesilaus. I would have had to upset the order I had established for my convenience and instruct a new man. That is what I never had the strength to undertake. I preferred to close my eyes so as not to see the artifices of Protesilaus. I consoled myself in making it understood to certain confidants that I was not ignorant of his bad faith. In this way I imagined myself only half deceived, since I knew I was being deceived. I even made Protesilaus aware from time to time that I bore his yoke with impatience. I took particular pleasure in contradicting him, in reprimanding him publicly for something he had done in deciding against his sentiment. But as he knew my haughtiness and my laziness, he was not bothered by all my grievances. He stubbornly returned to the attack. At times he used an insistent manner, at other times he used suppleness and insinuation. Above all, when he perceived I was upset with him, he redoubled his attention in order to provide me with new amusements, likely to soften me up, or have me embark on some affair where he would have the opportunity to make himself essential, and have the zeal for my reputation valued. Although I was on guard against him, this manner of flattering my pretensions always dragged me along. He unburdened me in my predicaments. He caused everyone to tremble through my authority. In the end, I could not resolve myself to lose him, but in maintaining him in his rank, I put all the good people in no position to represent my true interests to me. From that moment on, no free speech was heard in my councils. Truth distanced itself from me. Ruin, who prepares the downfall of kings, punished me for having sacrificed Phileuclis, the good advisor, quote unquote, to Idomeneus to the cruel ambition of Protesilaus, and is often the case in terms of valido government, that one has to essentially involve in these factional strifes and struggles and overcome a pre-established regime around an advisor or a favorite in order to insinuate yourself to become the new favorite. Even those who had the most zeal for the state and for my person believed themselves dispensed with setting me straight after so terrible an example. Myself, my dear mentor, I feared the truth would pierce the cloud and reach me despite the flatterers, for no longer having the strength to follow its light importuned me. I felt deep inside that it would have caused me cruel remorse, being unable to pull myself from so ill-fated a commitment. My softness, the ascendancy that Protesilaus had gradually gained over me, plunged me into some despair of ever getting my freedom back. I neither wanted to see so shameful state of affairs, nor to allow others to see it. In other words, the consummate state of being governed by a favorite has left the king so helpless, so weak, so cognizant and conscious of his own failings that Protesilaus, whilst also reaffirming that state of helplessness, actually, in terms of his own capabilities, imposes an air of confidence and authority for which the king himself cannot manifest to his subjects, hence reinforcing that state of dependency. And again, that was the exact same admonition that a lot of Fenelon's critics used against Fénelon himself in terms of the quote-unquote indoctrination he had effected on the young Duke of Burgundy. But nevertheless, as in often the case with these sort of things, there is an effected reform of this favorite, of this Protesilaus in Telemachus. As is often the case in terms of political comeback, some politicians will try to reimagine themselves, come back with a new sort of set of policies or principles, join a new faction, start a political comeback, such is the case of Protesilaus. But Mentor sees through this act of Protesilaus as a political chameleon, trying to conform with the new reformed king's wishes. Know that the wicked are not incapable of doing good, for they do it indifferently, the same as evil, when it can serve their ambition. Doing evil costs them nothing, because no sentiment of goodness nor any principle of virtue holds them back. But they also do good without difficulty, because their corruption carries them to do it in order to appear good and deceive the rest of men. They are not capable of virtue, though they appear to practice it. Eventually, Protesilaus will be thrown out, and some form of tranquility for the new kingdom of Salentum will be restored, which is where we come to a new figure, the great object of the wars which the Greeks are fighting in the south of Italy, in the region of Hesperia, which is King Adrastus of the Daunians. Part of the story, a large part of the story, is that Telemachus, having been sent to Salentum to find his father Odysseus, decides to place himself at the disposal of the king to aid in the defeat of his enemies, who have been involved in a conflict ever since they arrived. The whole sort of premise in terms of the legitimacy of that conflict, Mentor and by extension Fenelon also contest, but nevertheless the war will continue to the point that their enemy now has a tyrant as a king in the form of Adrastus. Telemachus will finally, leading the forces of Salentum and the Greeks, defeat the figure of this usurper king, Adrastus. Telemachus beholds this defeated tyrant and says, essentially, that the war is over, and to this Adrastus responds to Telemachus, "It is now that I know the just gods. They are punishing me as I merited. There is only misfortune that opens the eyes of men to see the truth. I see, it condemns me." And in response, Telemachus declares that learn by your downfall that the gods are just, that the wicked are wretched, that they deceive themselves in seeking felicity through violence, inhumanity, and mendacity. As we see with Idomeneus, who had himself being deposed from Crete, he has found his new kingdom. So Adrastus will have to accept that he himself has now been deposed as the king of the Daunians. He may find an opportunity for redemption in whatever form. He may, like Idomeneus, even go out and form a new kingdom, and he may rule it well. But despite the fact that Telemachus has spared the life of this evil king and offers a hostage exchange, Adrastus betrays him and nearly fatally stabs Telemachus with a concealed spear. And kind of like the Mithril moment in Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, where Frodo is stabbed by a cave troll and is saved by his mithril armor, Telemachus is only spared because he had received a divine intervention from the gods. And this comes back to an overarching point on the very nature of tyrannical government and the foundations of a tyrannical government being founded in that of fraud. The assembled Daunians asked, as their only condition of peace, now Adrastus has been defeated, they be permitted to have a king for their nation who could blot out, through his virtues, the dishonor with which the impious Adrastus had covered the kingdom. They thanked the gods again for having struck down the tyrant. They came in droves to kiss the hands of Telemachus, which had been dripped in the blood of that monster, and their defeat was for them like a triumph. Thus, tumbled in an instant without any recourse, that might which have threatened all the others of Hesperia, and caused so many peoples to tremble just as those terrains that appear firm and fixed, but are sapped little by little from below. Over a long period, the weak toil that attacks their foundations is mocked. Nothing appears weakened. All is level. Nothing shakes. Meanwhile, all the underground supports are destroyed, bit by bit, until the moment when at once all the terrain subsides and the chasm opens up. In this way, an unjust and deceptive might, whatever prosperity it procures through its violence, hollows out a precipice for itself under its feet. Fraud and inhumanity sap bit by bit all the most solid foundations of legitimate authority. One marvels at it, one fears it, One trembles before it, just until the moment when it is no more. It falls of its own weight, and nothing can lift it again, because it has destroyed with its own hands the true pillars of good faith and justice, which attract love and trust. This is true in certain respects. The first is that the tyranny weakens the core of the kingdom and the people itself, which is why a virtuous king is needed to blot out the reputation of the tyrant. The other clear theme, which is, you can say, actually the summary of why Fenelon is presenting his anti-Machiavellian treatise here, is that all of the guiles, the artifices, the outward professions, the presentation of strength, all of it is built on a crumbling foundation, where once there should be legitimacy which is found in a correct and a fundamentally good and benevolent order. In the absence of faith, in the absence of justice, all that effectively is demonstrated is an artifice, but without foundations, whilst it may at one point seem formidable, it crumbles, it destroys itself, as we see in the figure of Adrastus. Unlike Idomeneus, who slowly but surely, despite his many shortcomings as a king, finds redemption and establishes his new kingdom, Adrastus throws that opportunity away and is killed for it, despite, again, having nearly killed Telemachus in the process just before his final return to Ithaca. So what is the solution to this? What would Fénelon, what would mentors Athena present as the way to manage corrupt officials, the way to avoid flattery, the way to avoid government by the favorite, and indeed to resist, as we see with Adrastus and we see with Pygmalion, these tyrannical forms of government? How do you deal with these various men which you have to rely in terms of being able to run a kingdom in the first place? For a king cannot govern everything. And Mentor uses Idomeneus again as this example. Idomeneus is wise and enlightened, but he applies himself too much to details and does not mediate enough on material affairs in order to formulate plans. The capability of a king who is above other men does not consist in doing everything by himself. It is a gross vanity to expect to do anything and to persuade the world that one is capable of it. A king must govern in choosing and in guiding those who govern under him. He must not handle the details, for that is to perform the function of those who have to work under him. He should only have an account rendered of it, and know enough about it to go into that accounting with discernment. It is to govern marvellously, in choosing and in applying according to their talents the one who governs. The supreme and perfect government consists in governing those who govern. They must be observed, tested, restrained, corrected, animated, elevated, lowered, replaced, and always kept in hand. Which again echoes the sentiments which we saw earlier in terms of how Mentor views the role of the magistrate and its relationship towards the king in education and the presentation of the law. To want to examine everything for oneself is to distrust. It is pettiness, it is jealousy over middling details, which consumes time and the freedom of mind essentially for the big things. To form big plans, you must have a free and rested mind. You must think at ease and complete disengagement from all dispatches of thorny affairs. A mind drained by details is like the dregs of wine that no longer have either strength or delicateness. Those who govern through details are always convicted by the present without extending their sights to a distant future. They are always kept swept up in the affairs of the day, and that affair being the only one occupying them. It makes too strong an impression. It contracts their mind, for one can judge affairs properly when one compares them all together and places them all in a certain order, so they have the consequences and proportions of them. Already, you can say, the basis of monarchy in that sense, in terms of management, is to lead by example and to lead in terms of one's vision. But if you are a weak man, if you are mentally enfeebled or whatever, and you've gained your position of king through some sort of accident, or through, again, from the point of view of Fenelon's admonition, solely as a result of birth, you have not risen in terms of your state of heirdom to attain the necessary virtues of kingship, then you will fail, inevitably. Because what is the first thing you're going to do when you're presented with this? You're going to want to lean on a person who will give you all the answers, who is prepared to relieve from you the burdens of having to deal with the details and to provide that vision. Hence, we come back to Idomeneus and his reliance on someone like the favourite, like Protesilaus. To fail to follow this rule in governing, continues Mentor, it is to resemble a musician who is content to find some melodious sounds and who does not go to the trouble of uniting and harmonizing them to compose a sweet and stirring music. It also resembles an architect who believes he has done everything he can, provided he assembles great columns and lots of well-carved stones, without thinking of the order and proportions of the ornamentation of his edifice. In time, he builds a room. He does not anticipate that he must build a convenient staircase. When he works on the core of the building, he thinks neither of the court nor the portal. His work is only a confused assembly of magnificent parts which are not made for one another. This work, far from doing honour to him, is a monument that will eternalize his shame, for the work reveals that the worker did not know how to think broadly enough to conceive at the same time a general design for the entire work. It is a characteristic of short and subordinate intelligence. When a man is born with a predisposition limited to detail, he is only suited to execute under others. In other words, he's only suited to be a magistrate or a bureaucrat, a man who is obsessed with details, who can only see the wood for the trees and can't see the forest, is only, again, according to Fenelon, permitted to serve and not permitted to lead. Do not doubt it, O my dear Telemachus. The government of a kingdom demands a certain harmony, like a music, and just proportions, like architecture. If you want to continue using the comparisons to these arts, I will make you understand how mediocre men who govern through detail, the one who, in a concert, only sings certain things, though he sings them perfectly, is only a singer, the one who conducts the entire concert and who arranges in the same time all the parts, is only the master of music. In the same way, the one who carves the columns or constructs one side of a building is only a mason, but the one who thought of the entire edifice and had all the proportions of it in his head is the only architect. In this way, those who work, who expedite, who handle the most affairs of those who govern the least, they are only subordinate workers. The true genius, who leads the state, is the one in doing nothing, has everything done, who thinks, who invents, who penetrates into the future, who returns to the past, who arranges, who adjusts, who prepares from a distance, who unceasingly holds firm to fight against fortune, like a swimmer against the torrent of water, who is attentive night and day to leave nothing to chance. Having gone into the notion of the bad examples, the positive examples, and then the ideals of what kingship should necessarily entail, it's now incumbent to arrive at perhaps, you can say, even more significant questions, which is, what does the novel have to say about war and peace? Indeed, the whole notion of just war and the brotherhood of mankind, the relationship towards Greeks and other nations. What blind fury pushes wretched mortals? They have so few days to live on earth. Those days are so miserable. Why hurry a death already so near? Why add so much dreadful desolation to the bitterness with which the gods have filled this life that is so short? Men are all brothers, yet they tear each other apart. Ferocious beasts are less cruel than them. Lions do not wage war with lions, nor tigers with tigers. They only attack animals of a different species. Man alone, despite his reason, does what animals without reason would never do. But still, why these wars? Is there not enough land in the universe to give every man more of it than he can ever cultivate? How much deserted land is there? Humankind would not know how to fill it. What then? A false glory, a vain tide of conqueror that a prince wants to acquire ignites war in immense countries. So then a single man given to the world by the anger of the gods brutally sacrifices so many other men to his vanity. All must perish, all swim in blood, all be devoured by flames. He who escapes the sword and fire cannot escape hunger, even more cruel, so that a single man who toys with the whole of human nature finds in this general destruction his pleasure and his glory. What a monstrous glory. Can one abhor too much and scorn too much the men who have forgotten humanity? No. Very far from being demigods, they are not men, and they should be an Gratian to all the centuries in which they believed they would be admired. Execration. Oh, how kings must be wary of the wars they undertake. They must be just. That is not enough. They must be necessary for the public good. The blood of the people must only be spilled in order to save the people in extreme need. In other words, what we saw earlier, spill a little blood in order to save much, is what Telemachus cries out in terms of his whole rendering and his own experience in terms of dealing with war. He accepts the necessity of war, but there is an explicit repudiation running throughout all of Fenelon's works against glory, pride, and conquest. So how can a king apportion his role to that of conquest versus that of the role of peace? Indeed, when Telemachus is in Crete, and as we saw earlier, he is communicating with the jurists and the great lawgivers, the keepers of, you can say, the wise government of Minos. Telemachus, again, is asked the question about who rules better, the man who can only rule in war, or the man who can only rule in peace. And Telemachus says this: a king who only knows how to govern in peace or in war, and who is not capable of leading his people under both these conditions, is only half a king. The former is preferable. A king turned entirely to war would always want to wage it. Conquest, glory, to the ruin of his people. What does it serve a people that their king subjects other nations if they are unhappy? Telemachus points to the example of the long Trojan War that has left Greece leaderless. Never had any people had a conquering king without having suffered much for his ambition. A man who had defended his field against a neighbor, even usurped that of his neighbor, yet doesn't know how to sow, in other words, how to tend the land. And there's a reason. Up here, I have the image of Fenelon and Louis XIV, because it seems, again, Fenelon is directly responding to the king and his constant wars with little effect. In terms, again, of looking at a symbolic example, an idyll of what essentially a people in tune with the land and the people content to live in prosperity and peace is supposed to represent, we have the peoples of Boeotia. During one of the travels, Telemachus has this possibility of arriving in Ithaca early, had it not been for Poseidon's intervention, allowing for his Phoenician pilot essentially to go drastically off course. And it's through this Phoenician pilot that Telemachus learns all about these people of Boeotia. For reference, Boeotia, I believe, was a Phoenician province around modern-day Cadiz in Spain. The great kingdom beyond Gibraltar, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which is effectively the end of the Mediterranean and the end of the known world. What madness to put one's happiness in governing other men, the governance of whom is so difficult if one wants to govern them with reason and according to justice, this being the broad reasoning of the quote-unquote people of Boeotia, which was relayed through the Phoenician. A conqueror is the man the gods, angry with mankind, have given the earth in their anger to ravage kingdoms, spread fright, misery, despair everywhere, and to make as many slaves as there are free men. Again, the notion of to make slaves through war, to make slaves through absolute monarchy, that is the constant theme we see across all of these works. When the Greeks of Salentum finally, as we saw, defeated and killed the usurper king Adrastus, they also end up killing his cowardly son, Metrodorus, who tries to escape. The Daunians only have one condition for their peace, and it's to have a king who, as we found out, could blot out the dishonor of Adrastus to restore the foundations of legitimacy to their government. This forms a major dispute among the Greeks as to what to do with the defeated party, whether to partition it, conquer it, or indeed give them their wish to restore a legitimate authority, now essentially perceiving that the war was not against the people, but against the tyrant. And so this war now becomes an act of liberation and no longer a conquest. And so Telemachus, having his views informed by Mentor, on this topic and how to resolve this crisis for the people of Salentum suggests that if you give the Daunians a just king, he will lead them with justice. He will teach them how useful it is to preserve faith and to never usurp the goods of his neighbor. In other words, the foundations of a just and peace-loving monarchy and the abandonment of avarice and seeking the riches of others is itself a strong, if not perfect, guarantee of peace. And indeed, this whole conversation continues into a notion around the futility of conquest, as I've already alluded to. You want to divide their country among you. Here are their woes I predict for you, Telemachus. This people, pushed to despair, will restart war. They will fight justly for their liberty and the gods, enemies of tyranny, who will fight with them. If the gods join them sooner or later, you will be confounded, and your prosperity will dissipate like smoke. Counsel and wisdom will be taken away from your chiefs, courage from your armies, abundance from your lands. You will flatter yourselves who will be brazen in your enterprises. You will silence the good people who want to speak the truth. You will fall all of a sudden, and they will say of you, is that those flourishing peoples who are supposed to make the law for all the land, and who now flee before their enemies? They are the toys of the nations who trample them underfoot. Voila, this is what the gods have done. This is for the unjust, the lofty, and the inhumane peoples who merit this. Furthermore, consider that if you undertake to divide among you this conquest, you will reunite against you all the neighboring peoples. Your league, again, part of the political makeup of so many Greek cities during the Archaic and the Classical period, indeed the Hellenic period, was to organize certain cities around leagues. Seldom do you have great monarchies until we see the Persians and, of course, the Macedonians. But you have the Peloponnesian League, you have the Daunian, you have the Delian League, you have the Boeotian League, Thessalonica, all of these other sort of Greek city leagues united against a common enemy. These are all governments formed by alliances. Greece has a great preponderance of kings, and Ithaca is only a tiny little pebble in terms of the grander scope of kings. So the necessity and the logic revolves around forming alliances with all of these many, many kings. Your league formed to defend the common liberty of Hesperia against the usurper Justus will become odious, and it is you yourselves whom all the peoples will accuse rightly of wanting to impose a universal tyranny. In other words, a league that was formed for defensive purposes will be seen as an object of conquest. But let us assume you are victorious, not only over the people, over the Daunians, but all the other peoples. This victory will destroy you. Here is how. Consider how the enterprise will disunite all of you. And it is not based on justice. You will not have any rules to limit among you the claims of each. Each will desire that his part in the conquest be proportionate to his might. None of you will have any authority among the others to make this division peacefully. Voila, there you have the source of a war in which your grandchildren will see no end. It is not worth much more to just and restrain than to follow one's ambition with so much peril through so many inevitable misfortunes. And again, I can't help reading that. I feel there is a certain truth in what is being said there. The first emphasis on the notion that the partition will not be apportioned to anything other than might. Military might, again, is in terms of diplomatic accounting. It's essentially how someone like Kaiser Wilhelm saw foreign policy. He saw foreign policy as precipitating many, quote unquote, diplomatic conferences, which really meant diplomatic crises, in order to use the size of the German army and now the German navy, which he had created, in order to win international concessions. In so doing, he attempted to form a protectorate in Morocco against the French, and instead he got a concession in Cameroon, which is effectively worthless. Despite all of these, you can say, rather incredible advances made by the Kaiserreich in terms of establishing the second largest navy in the world for an empire which was relatively paltry compared to that of the French and the English, this policy had little effect. But the basic premise of it was, again, to impose divisions and partitions in foreign affairs as an extension of might. But if you're again trying to understand the causes of World War One, which I don't, but nevertheless, let's assume we understand the causes of World War One as rote, then this continuing loss of faith among the powers and this desire for partitions and conquests causes a general antipathy between the powers, which can act to cause a general precipitous conflict like we see with World War One. But again, claims and counterclaims, once you've established the right to possess a certain territory because you represent a people or a dynasty, then you will in turn create a claim on that territory that will not die with you. It'll be claimed by your ancestors and by your descendants. I mean, in the case of Louis XIV, he attempted to justify his conquests on the left bank of the Rhine using a series of councils called the Chambers of Reunion, which looked at very old basis of French conquest in those regions dating back to the Carolingian Empire, when following the dissolution of the Empire of Charlemagne among his descendants, West Francia at one point had a larger territory in its wars, I believe, against Henry the Fowler in East Francia. This is to say this all goes back to the 9th century. And this was used as the principal justification for expanding the borders of France at the expense of what was then Germany, the Holy Roman Empire. So rather than partitioning the kingdom among the conquerors, Telemachus has already recommended his solution, which is to provide the Daunians what they wanted, a king who could blot out the dishonor of Adrastus, and he proposes a man called Polydamas, a man who, according to Telemachus, knows the misfortunes, dangers, and difficulties of war, is much more capable of avoiding it than another who has experience of it, and he has learned to appreciate the happiness of a tranquil life, that being understanding of the land, peace, simplicity, agriculture. The theme of agriculture and the vaunted place it should occupy in terms of our understanding of economics and politics is a theme that Fénelon will return to repeatedly. It is no more useful, more certain, and more just to respond faithfully to the trust of the Daunians and give them a king worthy of commanding. In other words, why partition the kingdom? Why create an eternal enmity, not just of the people you have conquered, but in terms of the new sort of crises that it'll engender in terms of all the regional neighbors you've essentially insulted in so doing? But give the Daunians a king worthy of commanding. This whole notion again that it's not just a matter of awarding the Daunians with a just king, but to give them a leader, a man who can participate in the sphere of diplomatic affairs and be a potential ally to you. There is not just a moral, grandstanding logic on the horrors of war, but there is a political logic which permeates all these notions of peace. Again, better to elevate an ally in the future rather than basically create enemies out of everyone. Indeed, this echoes what Telemachus had said much earlier in the Adventures, when he was again talking about peace, and we were going through his reasoning again with the elders of Minos on Crete. If a king is suitable to govern in peace, he has the qualities necessary to safeguard his people. He is just and accommodating to his neighbors, never undertaking designs against them, and he is loyal in his alliances. If there is a restless neighbor, the king's other neighbors would join the peace-loving king. His faith and moderation render him the arbiter of all the states that surround him, while the enterprising king is odious to all, affirming that the willingness and preparedness to wage a war of necessity will prevent most wars, mental then states. As a mediator, you acquire a glory more solid and more sure than that of the conquerors. You reign over them through through trust, the custodian of secrets, the arbiter of treaties, the master of hearts. Your reputation flies, your name is perfume. Perhaps what I find so fascinating, and I would say ultimately reveals, you can say, a greater truth coming out of this assessment, is that I look at contemporary examples which Fenelon again was responding to, but indeed how this reasoning actually predicted many of the pitfalls of someone like a Napoleon. I seem to be alone in terms of my position on Napoleon and my sort of unique critiques of Napoleon, but a lot of my critiques boil down to the fact that he was the warmongering archetype that we see Fenelon chastise. If Fenelon was prepared to chastise Louis XIV, who I believe was far more earnest and sincere in his beliefs and his Catholicism than Napoleon ever was, Napoleon was all of the vices of Louis XIV taken to a comical degree. Yes, Napoleon's conquest and his grandeur was greater than that of Louis XIV, but his fall was also far more devastating, and also for that of the people of France. All of the criticisms which have been labelled at essentially the war-loving, the conquest-loving, the glory-loving king is almost perfectly encapsulated in a figure like Napoleon. And I come down to a potential sort of solution for the wars that was actually offered by Talleyrand back when he actually had influence over Napoleon, which was to make peace in a position of strength during the War of the Third Coalition. He had just defeated the Austrian army at Ulm. He could have treated with the Russians and the Austrians in terms of forming a lasting peace. Indeed, the overall foreign policy goal of someone like a Talleyrand was to form an alliance with France's, you can say, two natural adversaries, England and Austria, in order to build, as Fenelon, as we saw when I went over his biography, wanted to build, which is essentially that of a concert of Europe, a union of civilizations. But Napoleon decides to reject this advice, in which, to use this rather romantic association with peace, your reputation flies and your name will be perfume. You will be the master of hearts and the arbiter of treaties. Instead, Napoleon decided to reject those titles which had been offered to him by the solutions of someone like a Talleyrand 100 years later, 100 years after all of this, and instead resume the iron scepter and the sword of a conqueror. And he failed in that endeavor. So again, maybe I am partisan in terms of my reading of history, in terms of looking at this and seeing the truth in this. But I relay this and all of these admonitions to Louis XIV, and then I look to the future and see this in a figure like Napoleon, and then I look back in the past and look at this in a figure like Francis I, Henry II, or even further back to Charles VIII, another king who tried to make an ambitious conquest in Italy and failed miserably, only to precipitate a 50-year conflict with the Habsburgs that France would ultimately lose. So what was the point of all of this conflict? It goes back to the argument I was also making when I was talking about de-Christianizing the most Christian king, is that France's foreign policy was trying to find a way of resolving a fundamental contradiction. How can a Catholic king justify continual wars against other Catholic sovereigns? And the justification for this was divine right and absolute monarchy, being sovereign over France. And so Fenelon's solution was the exact opposite. It was appealing to the unity of mankind, the unity of Christendom, which essentially is what a far more deplorable and less sort of morally grandstanding man like Talleyrand, ironically, also being a bishop, it should be mentioned, would also echo those policies 100 years later. I tend to look at history in terms of these overarching, repetitive, sort of almost poetical elements. And as you can hopefully see in terms of Fenelon, Fenelon is so enmeshed in all of this. He's looking at precedents from antiquity, precedents from ancient history. His whole dialogues, the whole premise of his dialogues of the dead is to relive these experiences. It is to fabricate conversations between these two figures and understand their perspectives, and to essentially judge their shortcomings. So all of these ideas which I'm presenting, this is what Fenelon is almost obsessed with. But then I want to really end the policy examination, which is to go on to the trade and the economy, because this again is something that Fenelon was rather obsessed with. And again, a rather revealing notion in terms of his emphasis on the role of trade when he was talking to the Phoenicians. Receive all foreigners well, have them find your ports in safety and freedom. Never allow yourself to be swept up by avarice and pride, fear exciting their jealousy through your haughtiness. Be consistent in simple, straightforward rules of commerce. Accustom people to follow inviolably, severely punish fraud, negligence, and flamboyance of merchants that ruin commerce in ruining the men who do it. Above all, never undertake to interfere with commerce in order to make it accord with your own views. The reason why this is fascinating in terms of looking at this as an overall criticism of Louis XIV is that Louis XIV, and many of the quote-unquote Bourbon reforms that we see from Jean-Baptiste Colbert up until Charles III, a century later in Spain, is trying to make the economies, especially the global economies of the Bourbon empires, France and Spain, accord with the interests of the monarchy. And conversely, anticipating a lot of what we're going to see in terms of England and even France with figures like Turgot nearly a century later, Fenelon is advocating for, you can almost say, an extreme example of fair trade, one which is also based in severe simplicity and the abandonment of merchants basically pursuing ends and resources which encourage bad behaviors, flamboyance, self-gratification, excessive dress, all these sort of things. Fenelon believes in an idea of trade which is effectively in terms of being able to cultivate the essentials of civilization. He's not interested in aggrandizing societies, and he's certainly not interested in terms of broader notions of even the trade of wine, which again would be fatal to many sort of domestic French economies. He's rather severe in terms of his exposition in favoring temperance above all. And this whole sort of idea, you can say the severity, the simplicity, and the radicalism of Fenelon's position on the economy is further expounded when Mentor, much later in the book, talks about taxes and indeed idleness. Princes, avid and without foresight, only think to charge taxes to those among their subjects who are the most vigilant and the most clever in profiting from their possessions. It is because they hope to be paid more easily by them. At the same time, they charge those that laziness renders more destitute less. Reverse this evil order, and overburden the good and reward vice, and that introduces a negligence as ill-fated to the king as to the entire state. Put taxes, fines, and even rigorous penalties on those who neglect their fields, just as you would punish soldiers who abandon their posts in war. The plough will be honoured, handled by the victorious hand that would have defended the homeland. I look at this and I think of Draco, who was another great Greek sort of lawmaker. And Draco's admonition explicitly was his campaigns on idleness, his severe penalties for idleness. If there is an injustice in the system of taxation, it is the injustice of taxing the industrious and not taxing the lazy. Well, the solution essentially is to compel the lazy into a state of industry. And that again is to reinvigorate the process of agriculture. How Fenelon regards it, the plough must be honoured. And again, to look at this position, to abandon their posts in war, he sees the whole basis of working and tilling the land and making the land prosperous is the equivalent essentially of taking up a sword in terms of defending his or her own country. It's the notion essentially that prosperity, the need to build a nation towards prosperity, is just as incumbent in terms of a sense of patriotism as the physical defense of it in terms of war. He also talks about sumptuary laws. Many of it is going back to the whole notion of Roman stark simplicity. And I've already referenced the idea of Beatica and how the people of Beatica, according to the Phoenicians, looked on the idea of conquest and they saw it essentially pointless. But Beatica, especially as it comes forward in a figure like Adoam, who is the great Phoenician pilot who is telling Telemachus about, you can say, his very inflated opinion on this poetic idyll which he finds across the Pillars of Hercules. It comes back to how their economy functions, which again is really revealing in terms of how Fénelon sees economic activity in general. The Beatus runs through a fertile country and under a gentle sky that is always serene. The country took the name for the river that flows into the great ocean, somewhat near the Pillars of Heracles, and from the spot where the furious sea, breaking its dikes and separated on the land of Tharus from great Africa. This country seems to have preserved the delights of the Golden Age. The winters there are warm, the rigorous north wind never blows, the blazing heat of summer is always tempered by refreshing zephyrs that come to soften the air towards the middle of the day. So all year round is just happy in marriage of springtime and autumn, who seem to hold each other in hand. The land, in the value and in the flat countryside, beats a double harvest each year. There the trails are fringed with laurel trees, pomegranate trees, jasmine and other trees, evergreen and ever blooming. The mountains are covered with flocks that supply fine wool sought after by all known nations. There are several gold and silver mines in this beautiful country, but the inhabitants, simple and happy in their simplicity, do not even deign to count silver and gold among their riches. They only esteem what truly serves the needs of man. So when Fenelon was talking about how merchants corrupt their trade through flamboyance, the process of ruining commerce, Fenelon even means the process of ruining commerce by attaching a value to gold when it has a very nebulous value in and of itself in terms of achieving practical ends. This is the severity, you can say, of his desire to return to a simpler form of economy. When we began to trade with these people, we found the gold and silver among them employed for the same uses as iron, such as the blades of ploughs, for example. As they did no commerce outside, they had no need for money. They were almost all shepherds or ploughmen. Few artisans are seen in this country, for they only want to tolerate the arts that serve the true necessities of men. Even so, most of the men of this country, being devoted to agriculture or to driving flocks, do not fail to exercise the arts necessary for their simple and their frugal life. Read that again and understand that Fenelon's view is extremely reactionary, extremely Luddite in this view. A war on any sort of effective value in the economy, because if you're trying to look at this in terms of downstream effects, he's trying to understand the causes of war. He's trying to understand the causes of avarice. And if you assign a value which to someone like a Pygmalion, it becomes the object of his kingdom. The object of his kingdom is to acquire more and more, to acquire the things of others, but ultimately to gain nothing by them. All of this wealth is as sand in his hands. And such is his logic that carries through in terms of the idyll of Boetica. These things have no value other than the practical value, and it's incumbent upon merchants and free trade not to essentially corrupt and sell people things that they don't need, or worse, things that would lead them down the paths of vice, which were castigated so severely earlier on in this presentation, but simply to come back to this idyll of the industrious mode of agriculture. Looking at this in terms of the practical implications for political reform, I want to move away from Telemachus and come back to the ideas of monarchical reform from Andrew Mansfield, which I covered when going over the life of Fénelon, because it is effectively a more comprehensive exposition as to all of the themes that are brought out in Telemachus and how Fénelon wanted them to be applied practically in French society of his time. Like war, the quest for mammon, luxury goods, distracted the attention of men and kings by filling their minds with superfluities and away from real needs. His disgust with the effects of luxury led to the application of classical civic virtue as a means to control the rapacity and the vice of modern man. It was deemed to weaken society and effeminate man, infusing the court with vice while enervating the rich by maintaining the poor who dealt in such goods. Luxury should be prohibited, and men were encouraged to live frugally through labor harmonized with nature. This would restore balance to the social order, which had been overturned by luxury's ability to enrich the poor at the expense of the increasingly degraded nobility. degraded in the sense that they become nothing more than, you can say, ornaments around Louis XIV's Apollonian sun monarchy. Returning to simpler living in agricultural society will not only prevent this, but also the exodus of poor to the cities in search of work and trade of luxuries. A simpler alternative that garnered civic virtue was visualized by Fenelon's utopian version of Salentum, which was created at the end of the story when Athena finally decides to leave Idomeneus. Here, frugality were married to the industry of its peoples, and who engaged in the continual activity of agriculture and trade, not luxury trade, as we saw, in exchange for a dutiful king who sought the public good, enriching the people with liberty and with education. Fenelon's vision of a return to agrarian commerce relied upon a fusion of a classical vision of duty with Christian morality. His engagement of history drew on lessons from the ancients, not simply to emulate them, but to improve them for the benefit of contemporary Frenchmen. Louis XIV was positioned at the pinnacle of government and society, divinely sanctioned by God to rule his people in the manner he supposed fitting for France. The different parts of society, which included the nobility, were united in him, and he acted tirelessly and gloriously on their behalf. For many contemporaries, including Fénelon, the ancient nobility, or the noblesse d'épée, the sword, were ostensibly excluded from the administration of its mechanism, was realigned. While the king favoured the use of the newer robe nobility as administrators, the épée still preserved some influence at court and at a provisional level. The shift away from ancient structures and processes of government alluded to in Fenelon's works was deemed problematic, as the king now principally relied upon a limited group of nobles to be self-serving by the sword nobles who possessed an ancient responsibility to sacrifice themselves for the public good, while these new robe nobles had purchased their titles for personal gain. Venality, the idea of buying offices. Yes, as Fenelon says, you can say it encourages a certain government by avarice and government by purchase, but it was also a way to inject money into a desperately financially strained and war-torn country, and it was also a way to allow for some form of political and social mobility. The casting aside of the traditional nobility led to acrimony between these sword and robe nobles, plus, in Fenelon's opinion, the former had been made redundant. Rather than serving the state, they were sitting idle at court, often immured in vice and luxury. In other words, in the time of Louis XIV, and looking at his admonition against idleness, what have the reforms, what has the absolute monarchy of Louis XIV achieved? It has made the men who were supposed to be on the land and defending the country effectively redundant. And so the best thing to do is to allow them to rediscover a purpose or to put them to work. Fenelon's disapprobation regarding the indolent high nobility, combined with a need to fuel the revised machinery of France through commercial development, under the auspices of Colbert's brand of mercantilism, as I mentioned earlier. Colbertism focused on coinage and an attempt to control the flow of money in and out of France. Agriculture, which only generated limited returns, was not attributed much importance. Instead, Colbertism fixated on the capacity to attract silver and gold coin into the realm, making the kingdom more prosperous as this wealth circulated throughout it. Therefore, the better the commercial activity, the more coinage was in circulation, the greater the affluence and prestige of the state. The capital was controlled via direct and indirect taxation, and a belief that exports must exceed imports to ensure that capital was not leaving France. As it was assumed that Europe only possessed a limited amount of coinage, this was particularly important, so protectionism attempted to maximize profit and prevent the loss of wealth to others. Colbertism was an aggressive doctrine based on a zero-sum economic perspective, which relied on tariffs rather than free trade to increase profits at the expense of others. Indeed, Colbert believed mercantilism was a weapon of war, and it was juxtaposed with France's territorial aggrandizement as a method of gaining preeminence in Europe. Colbert's imperfect understanding of Dutch and English commercial success and his need to control policy rather than allowing merchants and manufacturing companies to develop freely meant initiatives stalled. As the aristocracy were precluded from engaging in commercial activity, the burden was placed under a new class, the bourgeoisie, to create economic prosperity in a country whose war consumed much taxation. Fenelon's utopian Telemachus became part of a long-standing discussion on commercial behavior and French foreign policy. In 1615, Anton de Chrétien had promulgated a belligerent system of mercantilism in his economic treatise. He argued that national wealth sufficient to subsidize the crown could be created through the development of trade and industry. Selfish individualism inherent in man could be fostered to offer social utility. Avarice and ambition would maximize profit when people enrich themselves. Montcretien employed Baudin's notion. Baudin, one of the great French theorists and advocates of sovereignty at the end of the 16th century in France, that God had ordered the world so that the goods were found in different geographical locations to bind humanity interconnectedly to precipitate a necessary exchange of goods. Baudin's outward-looking interpretation of trade was inverted by Montcretien. He proposed harnessing the desires to compete and emulate others so that France could achieve a mercantilist hegemony over the states and protect the welfare of its people. Fenelon's hostility to mercantilism was conspicuously expressed through the preeminence he gave to agriculture. His promotion of rural simplicity possessed two strands of thought. The first was a practical view of French society as a predominantly rural country, which meant that most people worked on the land. His desire to advocate industriousness through agricultural labor was logical because this was French society. It was also reasonable to encourage a strategy that relied on the bountiful natural resource of France. France in here is basically being used as an analogy for Silente Silentum, the kingdom of Idomeneus, while attacking a mercantilist policy that had embroiled France in injurious wars and economic torpor. His attack on luxury was born from the same vantage point. Luxury was a boon for extending trade, which could be taxed by the state. Unfortunately, the consequence of this trade was its accompanying effeminacy. The loss of civic interests as individuals were lost to distraction. Such destruction to the national industry of man found its unparalleled example in the French court. This environment provided an exaggerated depiction of the vice and laziness that had crept into the modern society due to luxury. Louis XIV's restrictive policies towards the higher nobility had artificially negated virtuous behavior as the social order had become undermined. Nature had essentially been subverted by an erosion of France's ancient form of government and a trading program which tolerated superfluidities to cause idleness. Idleness again, the horror of Fénelon for the redundancy of the ancient second estate, the nobles of the sword. All of these notions are consistent with the idea that he's looking from first moral principles. He's looking at behaviors that encourage vice, and he's also looking at behaviors that encourage a greater sense of the happiness of the peoples. And he looks at, say, for example, the wine trade or other trade in luxuries and declares that these are goods and service of vice and they maximize the income of the French state. Yet in the long term, they will cause massive injury in terms of the moral condition of the people of France. So for Fénelon, principles, the return to God, and a more sort of pure, selfless form of happiness will always supersede any strict notion of short-term material gain. And given everything I've said so far in this presentation, that can only really be expected. So this finally comes to a notion of Louis XIV and Fénelon's intentions with all of this. As I had already alluded to, Fénelon penned an infamous letter to Louis XIV, and most likely this was during the 9 Years' War. It expressed many of the themes in Fénelon as a direct, many of the themes Fénelon expressed in Telemachus as a direct response to the king's personal conduct, but this letter was never sent. Telemachus was also composed at the same time, and this was, it should be mentioned, published illicitly at the height of Fenelon's quote-unquote quietist controversy. Both of these things led to Fenelon's exile from Versailles to his archbishopric in Cambrai in the north. So Fénelon had to answer for himself. He had to respond to accusations that he was leading a campaign effectively to discredit and indeed damage Louis XIV and undermine his kingdom. If you remember what was said so explicitly about Idomeneus, from everything I've read about Fénelon and his views on Louis XIV, I think Idomeneus is actually an analogy to Louis XIV. He doesn't mentor Athena. Fénelon doesn't conceive of Idomeneus as this great figure. Rather, they perceive of Idomeneus as this mediocre figure who's given over to many failings, intoxications, habits, vices, for which he returns again and again. He is dispossessed of his kingdom, forms another, and nearly loses that one also in a war, and indeed due to his own corruption and dependence on favorites. And yet he struggles, he survives, and he's able to create a kingdom which is more prosperous than he found it, essentially redeeming himself. Idomeneus, in my mind, is Louis XIV, as Fénelon would essentially hope. And this is only echoed when you actually look at what Fénelon himself had to say in response to the illicit publication of Telemachus. It is true that I have put in these adventures all the truths necessary for government and any defects that may be in the sovereign power, but I have not labelled any with an allocation that tends to portrait of any character, which of course would be alluding to Louis XIV in terms of the accusations. The more you in this book, the more you will see that I meant everything without painting anyone. It's even a narration done in a hurry, detached pieces, written at different times. There will be much to correct. Moreover, the print is not consistent with my original. I prefer it should appear formless and incoherent than to give it away in the way that I did. All I ever wanted to do was to entertain the Duke of Burgundy, and to teach him by entertaining him with these tales, without ever intending for this piece to become public. Everyone knows that it has escaped me by the infidelity of my copyist. Finally, all the best servants of the king who I am acquainted with know what are my principles of honour and religion with regards to the king. On the state and the country they know my gratitude for the blessings and tender gifts the king has loaded on me, that being his membership of the Académie Française, his duty to be a tutor to the heir to the throne, and indeed his archbishopric. Others are more capable than me, but no one has more sincere zeal than I, and I think you can definitely say that about Fénelon. But as to his claim that he wasn't intending to paint anyone, it should be clear from everything I've said that that's demonstrably untrue. And part of a sort of ability to illustrate the fact that this is demonstrably untrue, that there are so many in the way of direct comparisons and analogies brimming in Telemachus. This, to my mind, was the most explicit accusation made against Louis XIV in Telemachus. And this again coming from the quote-unquote lips of Mentor. Remember the country where the domination of the sovereign is most absolute are those where the sovereigns are less mighty. They ruin everything. They alone possess the entire state, but also the entire state languishes. Countrysides are covered with weeds and almost deserted. Cities diminish each day. Commerce dries up. The king who cannot be king all alone and who is only given through his peoples annihilates himself bit by bit through the heartless annihilation of his peoples from whom he draws his riches and his might. His state is drained of money and men. This latter loss is the greatest and the most irreparable. His absolute power makes as many slaves as he has subjects. They flatter him. They pretend to worship him. This, in particular, raised an eyebrow for me in terms of the fact that Louis XIV presented himself as the sun god Apollo. They tremble at the least of his regards, but wait for the slightest revolution, This monstrous might, pushed to an overly violent excessiveness, will not know how to last. It has no resource in the hearts of the peoples. When I thought of this, again, I thought it was perhaps an allusion to the Fronde, which was the brief civil war that took place just before Louis XIV assumed his quote-unquote personal rule. This was in 1659. It has wearied and angered all the bodies of state. It compels all the limbs of that body to yearn for a change. At the first blow dealt, the idol topples, shatters, and is trampled underfoot. Scorn, hate, fear, resentment, distrust, in a word, all the passions reunite against an authority which has become so odious. And what he's describing there is not the reaction against Louis XIV, but it is the reaction against the French monarchy in the French Revolution, which again to Fenelon would be absolutely abhorrent, because Fenelon is not a revolutionary. Fenelon is a dynast. Fenelon is a man who believes in counseling those in positions of power and authority in order to correct their opinion and be reminded of their great responsibility. He does not desire to court public opinion. He does not desire to form broader public pressure groups. What pressure groups he does form are in terms of influential and high-ranking officials in the church and nobility, which is why perhaps we don't have more of the more visceral examples of criticism of Louis XIV appearing to direct and try and correct his behavior during the 9 Years' War and the War of Spanish Succession. And indeed, in terms of just putting on these various portraits of Louis XIV that appear in Telemachus, this was another obvious example to me, which is coming back to Tartarus and Odysseus wandering through the river Acheron, where Telemachus sees a little flitting shade, and the shade comes to him and says, "I was Nabopharzzan, king of superb Babylon. All the peoples of the East trembled at the sound of my name. Never did anyone dare contradict me, and each day they invented new pleasures to render life more delightful to me. I attended to maintain a continual intoxication. I was represented by a statue of gold. Now I am nothing, and no one laments me." Indeed, Charon, the ferryman on the river, carried the Babylonian along with some slaves who had been executed in order to honor the king's funeral service. Hermes had given the slaves these sacrificial offerings to the king and absolute power over the king whom they served on earth. They became the king's eternal tormentors. If the purpose of this example isn't obvious to you already, it is to say that whatever slaves that absolute monarchs, quote unquote, make in life, they will become their tormentors and indeed condemn them in eternity, in death. And whatever, again, wrongs they commit on life are far more terrible in terms of the fate that'll await them in the afterlife. Whatever glories, whatever superb Babylon was created, or greater France was created by Louis XIV, all of it will essentially end in the torment of eternal damnation, which is not a happy thought. So the solution, of course, was to take the young Duke of Burgundy, the second in line to the throne, Fenelon's great responsibility, and make him the anti-Louis XIV, who would be the antidote to Louis XIV. If Louis XIV, again, could not be Idomeneus, as I believe sincerely that Fenelon would have wanted him to be, then Burgundy was definitely to be Telemachus. And this is where we come in the end to the theme of pure love and Telemachus and his conclusion. Just before returning to Ithaca, Telemachus is overwrought with the responsibilities of kingship. He is plunged into grief before he is finally able to return to his father, and we see the real possibility of him becoming king of Ithaca one day. Indeed, Telemachus summarizes it in this short excerpt. "The state of a king is unfortunate indeed. He is a slave to all those whom appear to command. He is created for them. He owes his entire being to them. He is burdened with all their needs. He is the man of the people as a whole and of each individual. He must adapt to their weaknesses, which he corrects as a father, to render them wise and happy. The authority he appears to have is not his. It can do nothing, neither for his glory nor for his pleasure. His authority is that of the laws. He must obey them. Strictly speaking, he is the only defender of the laws, in order for the laws to reign. He must keep vigil and work to maintain them. He is the man the least free and the least tranquil in his whole kingdom. He is a slave who sacrifices his repose and his liberty for the liberty and felicity of the public. It is true, replied Mentor, that the king is only king in order to care for his people, like a shepherd for his flock, or like a father for his family. But do you find, my dear Telemachus, that he would be unhappy in having so much good to do for so many people? He redresses the wicked through punishments. He encourages the good through rewards. He represents the gods in leading all humankind to virtue. Has he not enough glory in keeping the laws? That of putting himself above the laws is a false glory, that only merits honour and scorn. If he is wicked, he can only be unhappy, for he would not know how to find any peace in his passions and in his vanity. If he is good, he should enjoy the purest and the most solid of all pleasures, to work for virtue and to expect from the gods an eternal reward. Having now completed Telemachus and tried to unite the themes of it as clearly as I can, given the time frame I've given myself tonight, I just want to finish with a brief segment from the article I brought up earlier by Benjamin and Lamb on Fenelon's pure love. Given Fenelon's theological and political worries about various types of self-interested love, it is no surprise that the converse is true of disinterested love, with which he took to underpin the standards of all religious rectitude and political justice. The pinnacle of this is charity, or pur amor, different terms for a disinterested love directed towards God. Fenelon describes this in his essay, Pure Love, arguing that higher love transcends the self and all its interests, for he that loveth without thinking of being loved has in him what is most divine in love, namely, transport, forgetfulness of self, and disinterestedness. Fenelon's stance is exactly the same in the Maxims of the Saints. In his view, only pure charity is morally untainted, because only it is the love of God, by which the self is utterly disregarded, and instead identification with God becomes happiness. Fenelon recommends a kind of love that is no way motivated by any benefit to the self. Instead, this love must abnegate the self altogether. In brief, Fenelon's love is an end in itself, which requires one to be reunited with something. God, in this case, beyond one's initial particularity. While disinterested love transcends petty individual concerns, it is not Fenelon's view that pure charity leaves human beings into a detached state of religious communion with God. This would be the admonition, basically, of the Quietists and the mystics and the sort of mystical variety of Fenelon coming through, the mystics. Rather, disinterested love is connected to social and political virtues. In the Maxims of the Saints, Fenelon insists that men are not only pure believers, but most just when they have this charity. Yet how does disinterested love make men just? Disinterested love is not a means to justice as an end. Rather, it is the fundamental principle of justice. Put another way, morality depends on the right kind of disposition. For Fenelon, pure love, when it is connected to appropriate and definite objects, lies behind all of the virtues and makes them perfectly practicable. He avows, there is, in the passive state, a reunion of all the virtues in love. 'Tis charity, as saith St. Thomas after St. Augustine, which is the form and principle of all virtues. That which distinguishes or specifieth them is the particular object which love does embrace. The love which abstains from impure pleasures is chastity, and this very same love, when it bears evils, takes the name of patience. The love, without going out of it, simplicity, becometh by turns all different virtues. And that is where I'm going to leave this discussion and the analysis of Fenelon's Telemachus. It was a pleasure to do the research into this topic. It sort of unites a lot of ideas which have come across about French and Catholic society at that time and the state of the political situation in France at that time. It provides, I believe, many predictions for the thought that's going to come across essentially to damn the monarchy that we see in Rousseau and the Philosophers, despite again being wedded to what I believe is a fundamentally more medievalistic and reactionary worldview, one that's not so much, again, wedded in a earlier form of the French monarchy that goes back before absolutism, but also wants to appeal to what Fenelon himself basically referred to as the profane virtues of pagan antiquity. His desire, again, to see Greece, not just Greece in terms of its poetry and its philosophy re-ennobled, but to see physical Greece restored and restored to Christendom, to see the Turk defeated, as if, again, it were just some recreation of the empire of Xerxes, and to see this newly ennobled free Greece joined in with the rest of Christendom, a pure sort of a humanist synthesis there. So, yes, an absolute joy to do the research, very much a labor of love. So I will go through your super chats, and if you do have any questions, do an @Apostolic Majesty in the chat, and I will endeavor to answer them for the time that I'm still here. Jackson Hawker 5165 for $10. So clear and so timely. Thank you, AM. Well, thank you very much, Jack. Aaron Fire 359 for $5. Thank you. I can't help but think of the Pharaoh from the movie Prince of Egypt. One weak link can break the chain of a mighty dynasty. Yes, that is true, in the sense that he was talking about Ramesses, but Fénelon isn't looking at this from the point of view of glorifying or wanting to sustain dynasty for its own sake. He's simply warning about the dangers of automatic inherited succession over other forms of coming to the kingship. And again, he doesn't present election as inherently superior. Remember, Telemachus is not elected to become king of Ithaca. Rather, he is born to the station, but he also ascends in terms of his virtue to be worthy of that position. That is the conundrum which Fenelon attempts to resolve. It is to unite inheritance of a kingdom with a personal journey, an odyssey. That is essentially what Telemachus is. Telemachus is an odyssey in terms of it being a literal journey and it being the attainment of the ideals and the wisdom of kingship. That is Fenelon's solution. In the case of Bocorus, all of these things were despoiled. And again, the tragedy of Sesostris is that his dynasty was so brilliant that it was prepared to tolerate what the people should, again, perhaps not have tolerated in their king. So dynasty here is actually used as a warning against the stability of a kingdom, that it can basically ennoble a king utterly deprived of any virtue. Aaron Fire 359 again for $10. Thank you. Do you think there is a similarity between the idea of kin right succession? All legitimate candidates of a dynasty are eligible for the kingship, and Fenelon's idea regarding kingship. Regarding kin right, it can be rather specific. I mean, the thing I think of when I think of kin right is I think of how succession laws used to occur in Russia in the medieval period. They tried to find a way of ranking all the princes in order to become the highest rank, which was either the Grand Prince of Kiev or then the Grand Prince of Vladimir. But they were all part of the same Rurikid dynasty. But that's not what Fenelon is advocating there. Fenelon is aware that Idomeneus and his family have lost their right of claim over Crete in the same way that Adrastus lost his right or claim over the Daunians. He's not so much concerned with kin right in so much as the kin represents the entire nation. So anyone of a nation may appeal to represent again the virtues and capabilities of becoming a king who is vested again, as far as Fénelon is concerned, with a trust and is subject to the law of that people. He doesn't seek glory in terms of trying to upend or supersede the law, or even in the case of Justinian, as Fénelon would regard, creating a legal system which is an extent of royal vanity in and of itself. So no, Aaron, I don't see that about Fénelon. Fénelon seems to have an incredibly fluid assessment of who has the right to become a king. So to put this another way, I think Fénelon would have been perfectly satisfied with a Napoleon Bonaparte under other conditions. So even if Napoleon had come to power in the way that he did so through a coup, and he did so by military glory. If Napoleon had, as was hoped, expected for a brief period during the consulate in the early empire, being a man of peace, to end the wars, as was hoped when he won the Battle of Marengo and won the War of the Second Coalition, then it's very possible that Bonaparte could have been a good king, as Fenelon would understand, and Fenelon would be perfectly prepared to accept by the logic which is expressed in Telemachus that the Bourbons have basically forsaken their rights to be kings by, you can say, the incompetent conduct of Louis XVI. I mean, that would definitely be the Hilaire Belloc view of it. I don't think he would see it that far. He would certainly look at a figure, if he had admonitions against Louis XIV, I can't imagine how he would think of Louis XV, which is even more tragic, because you have to look at this in terms of a series of lost possibilities for Fenelon, opportunities, because Louis XV was the Duke of Burgundy's son. So all of this had been designed to create the conditions of a real-life Telemachus returning to Ithaca, which was the Duke of Burgundy. But the Duke of Burgundy never becomes king. Instead, Fenelon dies, and it's the Duke of Burgundy's sex-crazed son who becomes king, becomes Louis XV. So the tragedy of the French monarchy simply compounds, and then Louis XVI, unfortunately, is left picking up the pieces. But I think there is a logic in Fenelon, as we see with Aristodemus in Crete versus Idomeneus, that if Napoleon were this Aristodemus type character, that he could have restored a just monarchy to France. Indeed, I have presented that view elsewhere across many different varieties and conversations regarding Napoleon, especially in 1802. I think the period of the early consulate really is that great moment when Napoleon could have been in a unique position to forge a European peace, but he failed, and he became the worst encapsulation of all of the vices of war, which are inherent in Fenelon's analysis. So yes, that's my answer to your question. I think there's a certain intellectual flexibility and fluidity that informs Fenelon's understanding of who has the right to become king. Rosa Fuso for $50. That's very generous, Rosa Fuso. Thank you very, very much. Thank you, AM, for your excellent work as always, and making me aware of more historical figures I am worse for not knowing. These concepts of conduct seem so obvious at the most basic level, but are historically so difficult to hold to. Yes, you should look at this image. This is actually an image of Telemachus with Athena. And interestingly enough, a girl is, again, we see a character who can perhaps again in the background be Odysseus or Homer. But this painting is the lamentation, it's the crushing realization of poor Telemachus that he may be deprived of all liberty in the sense of pursuing pleasure and all happiness in the way that especially people in modernity would see it. But what Athena has been trying to impart throughout the entire course of the adventures is that what he concedes, what most people concede as happiness, is not true happiness. And what true happiness is, in the Christian sense, is to be pursued through charity, which is you can say, accepting life as death and death as life, paradoxically, is the abnegation of the self. So it's a moment of great terror, fear, trepidation for the future, but ultimately becomes a moment of great triumph. To accept that one is death, but one has found again a means of attaining eternity. I think this whole attitude is actually completely alien to people nowadays listening to this sort of thing, because that is Christianity. And Telemachus is just sort of understanding the crushing weight and responsibility in all the ways that one can fail. Indeed, when Idomeneus is used as an example, and why there is so much emphasis in Telemachus on the role of wicked counselors, it all comes back to so many pitfalls. And what distresses Telemachus so much in Tartarus, it's seeing that there are kings who have simply been indifferent. There are kings who have been mediocre. There are kings who have been intellectually or morally weak. These are not necessarily evil characters, but they have all been consigned to Tartarus because they have failed in terms of avoiding all of these pitfalls. They have not become one with the people in terms of holding on to this trust and ensuring peace and prosperity, and thus achieving the eternal reward for them, which is an Elysium. So yes, the ideas seem obvious. And I think, again, this is something that people have a hard time understanding about Christianity, is that just because the principles are hard to live by, passing, a camel sort of passing through the eye of the needle, doesn't mean that they're wrong. The sort of permissiveness that we see nowadays is focused essentially on saying that the difficulty in terms of pulling oneself out of whatever vices that Fenelon has basically outlined should in many ways engender a certain moral relativity or apathy. But Christianity, again, is accepting that the royal road is an incredibly difficult one to walk. But thank you again very much for your super chat, Rosafuso. Aaron Fire 359 again, thank you very much for $5. Don't worry about the fan noise. We would prefer you to stay alive. Well, thank you very much. And I have managed to stay alive. I did actually turn it off in the end because it started creaking. And even I found it irritating. So I could only imagine how many of you found it irritating after a while. So I've been under the full influence of the heat for the last hour and a half. But thank you. Elfman for £5. Cheers for your good work. AM. Well, thank you very much, Elfman. All of your super chats this evening are very much appreciated, because I understand how difficult this topic is. I can also understand how relatively niche this topic is, which is a shame, because what I hope I've done this evening is that I've united many of the themes across many of my other talks and lectures, and indeed all the episodes of the Intrusible Chamber, to come to these conclusions. That's why, even though the topics in the Intrusible Chamber seem rather random, there is actually a common through line connecting them all, and why it can actually be instructive to go back and look at more of these things in depth. As was the case with Fenelon, I wanted to have a very expansive look at him, and I realized this would be impossible to do all in one stream. So by the time this is finished, I will have spent over 5 hours talking about Fenelon over the last week. But yes, I just hope you all enjoyed it. And Prince Josephus Komnenos is making an interesting point. So being born in the purple, as well as possessing personal virtue, is what is required for kingship. Ideally, the ideal is to be born into the purple, and then to, having basically endured youth and through patience attained wisdom, arrive at the kingship. Most of the figures that are revered in Telemachus are very old. grizzled old soldiers and generals, even Idomeneus. These are figures that have all become veterans of the Trojan Wars, and they've come back and they've all led a very sort of long, expansive life. You can sort of look at this and understand the rationale for the American Constitution and their desire to put minimum age requirements for politicians like the presidency. This is also something we see in Plato. Plato's ideal of the philosopher king is to essentially see that in life's education and to create the conditions for the ideal monarch, one needs to have read and absorbed so much that one can't even approach the idea of becoming king until what is in Plato's Republic, into his 40s. So that is a theme that's also running through Telemachus as well. It's that this allusion to Plato's philosopher king. And if I did not make that note more obvious, perhaps I should have. If you're going to look at Telemachus as I have, which is a work of philosophy in its most literal sense in terms of the reverence of Athena, the goddess of wisdom, and using her as an escort in which to undergo trials and tribulations in order to correct one's attitudes and one's personality, then obviously it should lead to a situation where we are talking about the philosopher king in Plato, and someone who unites wisdom and unites experience is the ideal. As for someone who is just born to the purple, I mean, the perfect example would be Marcus Aurelius as the great philosopher king, and then his son Commodus. You could almost look at Sesostris and Bacchus actually being an analogy for Marcus Aurelius and Commodus. Even though Fenelon, you can almost say from the point of view of his own life, political survival, will have to obfuscate and say that he wasn't intending to draw analogies or paint portraits in Telemachus. I think there is an interpretation to be made that Sesostris was Marcus Aurelius and Commodus was Bacchus. That being born to the purple again, which was rather rare in the Roman Empire, should be pointed out, was seen as some way as a qualification when it shouldn't have been. Which is why when you have fictional works like Gladiator or The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, there always seems to be this counter-narrative going on that someone like Marcus Aurelius would have preferred to anoint or elect a new king who had the requisite virtues, and we mean virtues in the Greek sense of that word, in terms of prudence and temperance, etc., and patience, but they are not encapsulated in a figure like Commodus. So yes, you can see, I think, a lot of Marcus Aurelius and the Stoics also running through the narrative of Telemachus. Yes, great circle of life from The Lion King. All right. Well, this is an interesting question from ROUSSEAU, who I'm very happy to answer more questions from you, considering you being so generous. Would Cincinnatus be a good example of Fenelon's description of a ruler? Well, Aristodemus almost fits that example, doesn't he? In terms of the neglected Cretan warrior who was called on to enter the position of kingship following the disgrace and the deposition of Idomeneus. And should he not live up to the role, in 2 years he will relinquish that life and then return to the simplicity from which he began. Yes, you can look at it like that. And I think there are elements in Cincinnatus, the love of the agriculture, the idyll of agriculture, the love of the simple life, and the lack of self-interest in terms of pursuing power, to attain power, to fight, to defend, and then to give it up. So yes, I think Cincinnatus is, at least in terms of looking at Roman comparisons, because these are Greek analogies that have been made, but I think if you're going to look at the Roman Republic, because I think a lot of Fenelon's political analysis is made based on his understanding of Rome, which of course was not a monarchy during, you can say, its golden age, that Cincinnatus will be one of these characters. And of course, in terms of echoing a lot of the sort of neoclassicist faddism of the 18th century, Cincinnatus was held up as an icon of the revolutionaries, of the philosophers, wanting to return to the golden era of Roman virtue. So I think that's a very perceptive point. Thank you everyone for listening, and I will see you again soon.